The morning of October 15th, 1917 arrived over the outskirts of Paris the way a verdict always does, cold, final, and utterly indifferent to appeals. Autumn had settled hard across the Ile-de-France that year, stripping the last leaves from the plane trees along the boulevards and leaving the city wrapped in a gray that matched the mood of a nation that had been at war for more than 3 years. In the gardens behind the Château de Vincennes, a convoy of black automobiles rolled through the pre-dawn dark and stopped beside the wide, flat stretch of ground known as the Polygon, a military firing range on the eastern edge of Paris where soldiers trained and, on rare occasions, conducted executions. The men who stepped out of those vehicles moved with the brisk efficiency of people carrying out a task they wished to complete quickly and leave behind. Inside the last car sat a woman named Margaretha Geertruida Zelle, though the world knew her by another name entirely, the name she had given herself more than a decade earlier, assembled from 2 Malay words that translated roughly as Eye of the Day, the poetic name for the sun. Matahari. She was 41 years old that morning, which was older than most people imagined when they pictured her, because the legend had frozen her somewhere in the electric prime of her Paris years, draped in jewels and diaphanous silk, commanding attention the way a lamp commands moths. The woman who stepped out of the automobile at Vincennes was older, softer at the edges, dressed in a pearl gray dress and a wide-brimmed felt hat she had chosen herself for the occasion. A nun from the convent of the Sisters of Mary had helped her dress. She had refused the blindfold. That detail would be recorded by nearly everyone present, and it would become one of the central images attached to her name, the woman who looked at death without flinching, who faced the rifles with her eyes open. What went through her mind in those last minutes has been debated and embellished for more than a century. What we know with certainty is this. She was 52 years past being a half-forgotten provincial child in a small Dutch city who had once been so beloved by her father that he called her his orchid. Leeuwarden sits in the province of Friesland, in the northern Netherlands, close enough to the North Sea that its winters carry the particular damp weight of salt air. It is a flat, orderly city of canals and neat brick buildings, of church spires and market squares, of the quiet Calvinist discipline that shaped so much of Dutch domestic life in the 19th century. It was here, on August 7, 1876, that Adam Zelle and his wife Antje van der Meulen welcomed their first daughter into the world. They already had 3 sons. They named the girl Margaretha Geertruida. Adam Zelle was a hat merchant by trade, and for much of Margaretha's early childhood he was a prosperous one. He had made a sound investment in oil shares sometime in the 1870s, and this stroke of financial luck elevated the Zelle family well above the ordinary merchant class of Leeuwarden. The family moved into a large house in the center of the city. They kept servants. The children wore good clothes. Margaretha went to school in a carriage, which was uncommon enough in a city of that size to attract comment. She was, by all surviving accounts, a strikingly beautiful child, dark-eyed, olive-skinned in a way that seemed to carry some hint of the exotic even in the flat northern light of Friesland, with thick dark hair and a quality of physical presence that made adults notice her. Her father noticed it too, and he let her know it. He called her his orchid. He dressed her well beyond what utility required. He gave her a small goat to ride to school, an indulgence so theatrical that it became part of local legend. Adam Zelle was a man who adored spectacle. He adored it in commerce, in personal style, in the way he presented his family to the world. He was known throughout Leeuwarden as a man of good humor and broad generosity, the kind of father who made his children feel that life was essentially a grand occasion and that the people at its center were the ones who dressed the part. Margaretha absorbed this entirely. She watched her father work a room, command attention, fill a space with the force of his personality, and she tucked away those observations the way a child tucks away lessons in an unnamed part of the mind that only makes itself known years later. She adored him, and the adoration was reciprocated with a fervor that her brothers did not quite receive. There was a particular bond between Adam Zelle and his only daughter that shaped everything that followed. The prosperity held through Margaretha's earliest years, through the carriage rides and the goat and the good dresses and the house in the city center. Then it didn't. The oil investments that had built the family's comfortable life began to unravel around the time Margaretha turned 10 or 11. The exact sequence of financial events is not entirely clear from the historical record, but the outcome is well documented. By the early 1890s, Madame Zelle had been bankrupted. The house was sold. The servants were dismissed. The family relocated to the much smaller provincial town of Franeker, where Adam attempted to start over in the hat trade on a more modest scale and found that modest scale did not suit his temperament. The carriage was gone. The goat was gone. Most of what had defined the Zelle family's standing in Leeuwarden was gone. Margaretha was 15 years old when her mother died. Antje van der Meulen had been ill for some time, worn down by the combination of economic stress and the physical demands of raising 4 children, and she passed away in 1891. The loss was immediate and profound, but in some ways the consequences that followed proved even more destabilizing than the grief itself. Adam Zelle, unable or unwilling to raise his children alone in the scaled-down existence of post-bankruptcy life, effectively dispersed the family. The boys were sent to various relatives. Margaretha, the cherished orchid, was sent to live with her godfather, a man named Visser in the city of Sneek, not far from Leeuwarden in geographical terms, but a world away in the sense of warmth and belonging that she had known before. The household in Sneek was not unkind, but it was not home. Margaretha had gone from being the center of her father's attention, his most beloved ornament, the girl who rode a goat to school and wore the best dresses in the class, to being a guest in someone else's house, dependent, displaced, visibly diminished in the social standing that had once seemed so permanent. The fall from that kind of early abundance is a particular kind of loss. It doesn't just take away the things themselves. It takes away the certainty that the things were real, and it plants a question that some people spend the rest of their lives trying to answer. Who am I when I have nothing to show? For Margaretha Zelle, that question would eventually become the engine of everything. It would drive her out of the Netherlands and across the world, into a marriage she couldn't have predicted and couldn't survive, into a new identity built from scratch on the other side of Europe. It would drive her, ultimately, into the gray October morning at Vincennes and the ring of men with rifles who were waiting for her. But in 1891, in the quiet respectability of her godfather's house in Sneek, she was still just a girl of 15 with dark eyes and no certain future, trying to make sense of the distance between where she had been and where she now found herself. The orchid tipped from its pot. Her father remarried in 1893. The woman he chose was someone Margaretha had not met before the wedding, and the marriage created a new household that felt even less like a place for Margaretha than Sneek had been. Adam Zelle's attentions had shifted, and the particular intimacy she had shared with him, the one that had defined her early childhood, was not something his new life had room for. He would continue to exist at the edges of her adult story, surfacing occasionally when she was famous and again when she was in trouble, but the relationship never recovered its original warmth. What Margaretha had left, in those years between her mother's death and her own departure from the Netherlands, was primarily herself. The dark eyes, the physical grace, the sense of presence she had inherited partly from biology and partly from watching her father command a room. She also had ambition without a clear object, the kind of restless energy that accumulates when someone who has been told they are extraordinary has not yet found the stage that matches them. She carried that energy into the next phase of her life, which began, as so many decisive things do, with an advertisement in a newspaper. In 1894, she was 18 years old. The advertisement in De Telegraaf was brief, direct, and unremarkable by the standards of its time. A Dutch colonial officer, recently returned to Amsterdam from service in the Dutch East Indies, was seeking a wife. He listed his requirements in the businesslike language of a man who had learned to express himself in orders and reports. He wanted someone with a pleasant disposition and a reasonable appearance. He was prepared to offer the security of an officer's household and, presumably, the adventure of life in the tropics. His name was Rudolph MacLeod, and in the autumn of 1894 he was 38 years old. exactly twice the age of the 18-year-old girl in Sneak who read the advertisement and, on an impulse that seems remarkable in retrospect, decided to respond. Impulse is probably not the right word. What Margaretha Zelle felt when she read that notice was something more calculated and more desperate than mere impulse. It was the recognition that an opportunity had presented itself and that she might not get another one of equal clarity. The choices available to a young Dutch woman of limited means in 1894 were not expansive. She could work as a teacher or a governess, roles that offered subsistence but not much beyond it. She could wait for a local man to propose, which would mean a local life in a small city with a provincial horizon. Or she could reach for something outside the expected radius, as her father had once done when he bought those oil shares with money that wasn't really there to spare. The same gambler's instinct he had passed along to her without meaning to. She wrote back to Rudolf MacLeod. He responded. They exchanged several letters over the following weeks, the correspondence carrying the careful formality of two people conducting a negotiation they had agreed to frame as a romance. MacLeod traveled to Sneak to meet her in person, and the meeting apparently satisfied both parties, though for different reasons. MacLeod saw what he had hoped for. A beautiful young woman with striking dark eyes and the kind of physical presence that distinguished her immediately from the room. Margaretha saw a route out of the Netherlands, out of the reduced circumstances she had been living in since her father's bankruptcy and her mother's death. A route toward something larger and more vivid, even if she couldn't yet name exactly what that something was. They were engaged shortly after meeting. The wedding took place on July 11, 1895, in Amsterdam. Margaretha Geertruida Zelle became Margaretha MacLeod, a name she would carry for years afterward through marriages and pseudonyms and courtrooms, the way a scar carries the memory of its original wound. She wore a dress that by the surviving accounts was beautiful, and she was, by those same accounts, a radiant bride. She was 19 years old. Rudolf MacLeod was 39. The marriage, from its earliest days, contained the seeds of nearly everything that would eventually destroy it. Rudolf MacLeod is a figure whose nature has been read differently by different historians, but the primary sources, including the testimony of Margaretha herself in later years, supplemented by letters and official army records, paint a consistent portrait. He was a man of the Dutch colonial officer class, trained in the rigid hierarchies of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, shaped by years of service in a colonial apparatus that was itself built on the organized exertion of authority over enormous distances and subjected peoples. He had the bearing of a man who gave orders and expected them to be followed. He also had a serious drinking problem, which he had apparently managed to conceal or minimize during the courtship correspondence, and which became fully visible within the first year of marriage. He was not, by the understanding of his era, doing anything exceptional when he drank heavily and was verbally abusive. The colonial officer culture of the 1890s did not encourage introspection about what we would now recognize as alcoholism. It also did not offer his wife any meaningful legal recourse. Margaretha had married outside the Netherlands before she had any real experience of what a difficult marriage looked like from the inside, and she found herself bound to a man whose affections ranged from cold to actively cruel depending on how much gin he had consumed. They spent their first year together in Amsterdam and The Hague, where MacLeod was stationed while awaiting his next colonial posting. Their first child, a son they named Norman John, was born on January 30th, 1897. He was a healthy baby, and Margaretha's accounts suggest she loved him with the intensity of someone who had been looking for a fixed point in an increasingly unstable life. The marriage continued to deteriorate. MacLeod's drinking worsened. His treatment of his wife oscillated between indifference and volatility. In the spring of 1897, MacLeod received his orders. He was to be posted to the Dutch East Indies, to the island of Java. Margaretha and the infant Norman would accompany him. It was the colonial arrangement of the era. Officers brought their families to the Indies, maintained European households in the garrison towns, tried to reproduce the domestic rhythms of home in a landscape that was comprehensively unlike home in almost every respect. The steamship voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia, the colonial capital of Java, the city that now exists as Jakarta, took approximately 4 to 5 weeks by the established route through the Suez Canal. Margaretha arrived in Java in the final months of 1897, and the impact of that arrival cannot be overstated in terms of what it did to her imagination. Java was nothing like the Netherlands. It was nothing like anything she had ever encountered in her previously circumscribed life. The heat was total and physical, a dense tropical warmth that pressed against the skin from every direction simultaneously. The vegetation was explosive, deep greens in every shade, flowers in colors that seemed improbable after the careful northern palette of Friesland. The sounds were different. The rhythm of gamelan orchestras drifting from villages at night, the calls of unfamiliar birds, the particular buzz and hum of an equatorial world in perpetual biological motion. And the culture, the Javanese culture that existed beneath and alongside and in complicated relationship with the Dutch colonial apparatus, was ancient, ornate, and absolutely unlike anything the Reformed Protestant tradition of the Netherlands had prepared Margaretha to encounter. She watched the Javanese temple dances. She observed the ceremonial traditions of the courts, the elaborate costumes and the precise ritual movements of the female dancers who served the princes and the sacred spaces. She was captivated. She had the kind of receptive, acquisitive imagination that takes in everything and stores it in a form that can be deployed later, and she stored all of this, the silks, the incense, the gestures, the mythology, with the thoroughness of someone who understood instinctively that she had found material she would eventually find a use for. It should be noted clearly, because historians have been explicit on this point. Margaretha Zelle was not trained in Javanese sacred dance. She was a European woman who observed these traditions from the outside and absorbed an impression of them, accurate in its surface details and fundamentally wrong about its meaning and purpose. The dances she later performed in Paris were not Javanese temple dances. They were European performances inspired by Javanese aesthetics, filtered through the imagination of a woman who had lived in Java and paid close attention to what she saw. This distinction would matter tremendously later, though not in the way anyone might expect. MacLeod's posting took the family to several garrison towns across Java. He served for a period in Ambarawa in central Java and later at Sindanglaja, a hill station near Bandung where the Dutch went to escape the worst of the lowland heat. A daughter, Louise Jean, called Nan by the family, was born in 1898. The marriage continued to be miserable. MacLeod's drinking showed no signs of moderating. His temper, by Margaretha's later accounts, became more uncontrolled as the years in Java accumulated. He kept a Javanese concubine for a time, which was not unusual among colonial officers but was a humiliation that Margaretha recorded and did not forget. Then, in June 1899, their son Norman died. He was 2 years and 5 months old. The cause was recorded at the time as syphilis-related complications, and the manner of transmission has been disputed ever since, with some accounts suggesting the children were inadvertently poisoned by arsenic and strychnine given to them by a servant, an act of vengeance against MacLeod, whose treatment of the local population had made enemies. Whether that account is accurate is something historians have been unable to determine with certainty from the available evidence. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Norman was gone. He had been Margaretha's anchor in an increasingly hostile domestic life, and his loss was a wound that went very deep. MacLeod and Margaretha stayed together in the Indies for several more years, the marriage grinding forward through accumulated resentments and a grief that had no clean resolution. They returned to the Netherlands in 1902. The return did not improve things. MacLeod filed for divorce in 1902, and the proceedings were acrimonious even by the standards of Dutch domestic law. He was granted custody of their daughter Nan. Margaretha received almost nothing. The courts were not inclined, in 1902, to favor wives in divorce proceedings, particularly when the husband held military rank and social standing. She was 26 years old, legally separated, practically penniless, with no home of her own and no claim to the one surviving child she loved. She contested the custody arrangement for years, writing letters and pressing legal arguments and making periodic attempts to see Nan that MacLeod systematically obstructed. Nan would grow up without her mother. The relationship between them was cordial but distant, shaped entirely by MacLeod's interference and the simple fact of their physical separation during the years that mattered most. What remained for Margaretha, in the autumn of 1902, was the memory of Java, those dances, those silks, that heat, and the particular look that a stranger gave a beautiful woman on a street in Amsterdam or The Hague, a look she recognized and knew how to read. She had nothing, and she was nobody particular. She had the Indies behind her and a broken marriage in her file and a daughter she had effectively lost. She had dark eyes and good bones and an imagination unconstrained by the requirements of honesty. She had Paris in mind. She had always, in some sense, had Paris in mind. She arrived in Paris sometime in late 1903 or early 1904, depending on which account you follow. The historical record on the precise timing is imprecise, which is fitting, because Margaretha Zelle's arrival in Paris was not the kind of arrival that gets documented. She did not come with letters of introduction or a contract or a formal invitation. She came the way thousands of poor, ambitious Europeans came to Paris at the turn of the century, with almost nothing in her pockets, a vague plan, and the conviction that the city owed something to people who were prepared to perform. Paris at the turn of the 20th century was a city that had been consciously and expensively reimagined as the capital of pleasure. The wide boulevards that Baron Haussmann had cut through the medieval tangle of older Paris in the 1850s and 1860s were now lined with cafes, department stores, theaters, and the particular kind of establishment that existed in a productive middle ground between all three: the music halls, the cabarets, the review houses where singers and dancers and acrobatic performers competed for the attention of audiences that expected regular spectacle. The city had just concluded its second Universal Exposition, the Exposition Universelle of 1900, and Paris was still living in the afterglow of the enormous international attention that event had drawn. The Eiffel Tower had been standing for 11 years. The metro had just opened. Electric light was transforming the city's streets and entertainment venues, replacing gas with something brighter and more generous. Exactly the kind of illumination that turned performers into something approaching gods. It was also a city in the grip of a serious and sustained fashionable obsession with the Orient. The word Orient was applied with extraordinary liberality in Paris at this time. It stretched to encompass the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, North Africa, Egypt, and Japan, often indiscriminately, as if the entire non-European world east of Vienna was a single aesthetic reservoir from which creative people could draw costumes, motifs, stories, and atmosphere. Diaghilev's Russian ballet would make the obsession explicit and spectacular a few years later, but the appetite was well established before Scheherazade ever hit the stage. Parisian audiences in 1903 and 1904 were primed for whatever the exotic could offer them. They wanted mystery. They wanted bare skin dressed in silk and jewels. They wanted a story about somewhere else. Margaretha Zelle was the thing those audiences were waiting for, and she understood this in the particular way that con artists and visionaries share, the ability to see precisely what a crowd wants before the crowd has fully articulated it, and to make yourself into the supply for that demand. Her first months in Paris were difficult. She had come with references to a number of people who might be able to help her find work, some artistic, some social. But Paris was full of beautiful foreign women looking for patrons, and the city's charity was selective. She modeled for artists. She appeared as a circus performer briefly on horseback under a different name. She haunted the artistic circles of Montmartre, and the salons where painters and poets and the people who funded painters and poets congregated in that intimate arrangement that had made Paris culturally dominant in Europe for 2 generations. She was noticed. She was always noticed. But being noticed was not the same as being launched. The launch came through a specific figure, Émile Guémet. Guémet was an industrialist from Lyon who had spent decades and a significant portion of his personal fortune assembling one of the finest collections of Asian art in the world. He had traveled extensively through Japan, China, India, and Egypt in the 1870s and 1880s, and he had returned with crates of objects, sculpture, ceramics, textiles, manuscripts, that he eventually housed in a specially built museum in Paris, the Musée Guémet, which opened in 1889 and quickly became a center for what Parisians called Orientalist culture. Guémet himself was a passionate promoter of Asian art and religion. a man who organized lectures and concerts and theatrical performances that presented these traditions to Parisian audiences in the sumptuous context of his museum's collection. He was also a man who responded to beautiful women with an enthusiasm that he made little effort to conceal. Margaretha met Guillemette through the social circles she was working her way into during those early Paris months. The account of exactly how their relationship developed is not entirely clear from the surviving letters and memoirs, but the outcome is well documented. Guillemette agreed to give her a platform. He would host a performance at his museum in early 1905, framed as a sacred Hindu or Javanese ritual dance, a religious ceremony from the East presented within the reverent context of his Temple of Asian Art. It was during this period, late 1904 and into the winter of 1905, that Margaretha Zelle ceased to exist in any public sense, and Mata Hari came into being. The creation of the persona was deliberate, systematic, and thorough in a way that speaks to a specific kind of intelligence. Margaretha did not simply give herself a new name. She constructed an entire identity with the completeness of a novelist building a fictional character. Backstory, physical presentation, interpretive framework, and origin myth, all interlocking and mutually reinforcing. The name Mata Hari she drew from the Malay she had absorbed in Java, where Mata means eye and Hari means day. Together the phrase is a poetic name for the sun. She had heard Javanese servants and local people use it, and she stored it. Now she deployed it. The backstory was constructed in detail. When journalists and admirers asked about her origins, she did not say Leeuwarden, Netherlands. She told them she had been born in a temple in Java, the daughter of a Javanese temple dancer and an Indian Brahmin officer. She had been raised in the sacred dance traditions of the temple, trained from childhood in ritual movements that were simultaneously religious ceremony and art form, and she had come to Europe to share those traditions with audiences sophisticated enough to appreciate them. Details shifted in the telling. Sometimes her mother was a princess, sometimes the father's identity changed, sometimes the geographic location of the temple varied, but the essential architecture remained consistent. She was a sacred dancer from the East, and what she was about to show Parisian audiences was something ancient and holy, not entertainment in the ordinary sense. This was a fiction. It was a careful, sustained, and commercially effective fiction, but it was not even remotely true. Margaretha came from Leeuwarden. Her parents were a Dutch hat merchant and his wife. She had lived in Java for several years as a colonial officer's wife, and she had watched Javanese dance with great attention and retained what she saw with great accuracy of surface detail. That was the extent of her connection to the tradition she claimed to embody. It needs to be said plainly, however, that Margaretha was not alone in this kind of self-invention. The Paris of 1905 was full of artists and performers who had remade themselves across the distance between their actual origins and the persona they presented. The entertainment culture of the Belle Époque ran on mythology. It expected performers to be extraordinary. It wanted their lives to be as spectacular as their performances. In this environment, the lie was almost a professional requirement. The audience understood that they were paying for a dream, and they were irritated when something as mundane as biographical accuracy was allowed to interrupt it. For the performance itself, Margaretha had been studying and rehearsing throughout the winter. She had ordered and in some cases constructed her own costumes. Garments inspired by the Javanese temple dance traditions she had observed, featuring elaborate headdresses, jeweled breastplates, richly colored fabrics that moved as she moved. The costume was designed to reveal considerably more of her body than European women typically appeared in public. The arms bare, the midriff sometimes visible, the dancing itself a series of slow, sinuous movements involving the hands and arms in gestures drawn from the Madras vocabulary of Indian and Southeast Asian classical dance. The gestures were real. She had observed them with genuine care, but their sacred significances were lost in translation to a museum in Paris, and nobody in the audience was positioned to know the difference. The first performance at the Musée Guillemette took place on the morning of March 13, 1905. The date is recorded. The guest list was composed of what Guillemette could assemble from the Parisian artistic and intellectual elite. Painters, writers, critics, titled members of the French and foreign aristocracy, diplomats, journalists. Guillemette introduced the performance with remarks that framed it in the most reverential terms. This was not a show, he explained, but a ceremony, a glimpse into the sacred traditions of the Far East, and his guests should attend it with the appropriate spirit of reverence and open curiosity. Then Margaretha appeared. The accounts left by people who were present that morning converge on several consistent points. She moved slowly, entering the space from behind one of the great bronze statues in the museum's collection, the dim lamplight catching the jewels of her costume and the incense that had been lit to create an atmospheric haze in the air. She was 36, no, she was 28, nearly 29, and she was at that precise moment of physical maturity where beauty becomes fully confident of itself. She danced. The movements were unhurried, deliberate, each position held long enough for the audience to absorb it before flowing into the next. There was no orchestra in the conventional sense. A small ensemble played instruments of Asian origin, the sound thin and foreign and evocative in the stone halls of the museum. When it was over, the audience sat in silence for a moment before the applause began. The reviews that appeared in the Paris press in the days following were exceptional. Critics described the performance as a revelation, as authentic spiritual art, as the most striking thing they had seen in years. Several of the most prominent cultural journalists in the city wrote extended pieces about the performance and the mysterious woman who had given it. The name Mata Hari appeared in print repeatedly, in connection with the words sacred, exotic, mysterious, hypnotic. Within a week, the social world of Paris knew the name. She was launched. The woman who had arrived virtually unknown from the Netherlands a year earlier, the divorced colonial officer's wife with almost no money and a child she wasn't allowed to see, was now the sensation of the Paris season. Invitations began to arrive. Requests for further performances multiplied. Wealthy men who had been in the audience at the Guillemette sent calling cards and flowers and, eventually, more substantial tokens of interest. Margaretha had understood very clearly, from the beginning, the economic structure of the world she was about to enter. The performances were income, but patrons were wealth. She was not naive about what being kept by a wealthy man required, and she was not inclined to pretend otherwise in her private correspondence. She had already lived through a marriage to a man who had the power to make her life miserable, and she had come out of it with a clear-eyed understanding that dependence without terms was simply a different kind of trap. She intended to have terms. She intended to keep the power of the choice. The Paris spring of 1905 opened before her like a door she had been standing outside for years. She walked through it without looking back at the carriage rides and the goat and the flat, wet winters of Leeuwarden. She walked through it without, for the moment, looking at the gray morning in the future that was already being assembled without her knowledge. She had a new name, a new story, and a city that believed her. That was enough to work with. The world that received Mata Hari in the spring of 1905 was in the final years of what the French would later recall with a specific wistfulness. The Belle Époque, the beautiful era, the period between the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and the catastrophe of 1914. It was not, in reality, universally beautiful. The same Paris that produced Impressionism and the Moulin Rouge also contained factory workers living in appalling conditions, colonial subjects suffering under European domination, and a political class oscillating between scandal and corruption. But the cultural surface was genuinely extraordinary. Paris had concentrated, by accident of economics and geography and history, an almost implausible density of creative talent, financial patronage, and audiences sophisticated enough to appreciate innovation. Into this world, Mata Hari fitted with a precision that seemed almost designed. She was not the first performer to work the intersection of Eastern aesthetics and Parisian appetite for the exotic. Lois Fuller had been doing something related with light and fabric and vaguely Oriental references for years, but she had a specificity and a personal mythology that the other practitioners lacked. She had a face, a story, and a name. She had the Guillemette performance behind her as an authenticated origin point. And she had the quality that a certain kind of performance absolutely requires and cannot be manufactured. She genuinely commanded the room. Performers who remember Mata Hari from those years, and several left detailed memoirs and letters, consistently described the same quality in her stage presence. It was not purely about beauty, though she was undeniably striking. It was something more architectural, the way she occupied space, the deliberate pace at which she moved, the sense that she was entirely unafraid of the audience's attention and could bear any amount of it without flinching or performing self-consciousness. In an era when female performers generally signaled awareness of the male gaze through one of two available modes, coy deference or aggressive theatrics, Mata Hari seemed genuinely indifferent to whether the audience approved. She moved as though the approval was already settled. That quality of certainty, constructed though it was, read as authority. The performances that followed the Guillemette debut in 1905 took her across Europe with a speed that suggests how quickly the reputation spread. She performed in London, Madrid, Monte Carlo, Berlin, Vienna, and Milan over the next several years, appearing in theaters, private salons, and the ballrooms of grand hotels before audiences that included European royalty, heads of state, military officers from several nations, industrialists, artists, and aristocrats. The programs varied depending on the venue and the audience. The most theatrical productions included elaborate scenic dressing, orchestral accompaniment, and lighting effects designed to heighten the mystical atmosphere. The more intimate salon performances were exactly that. A woman in extraordinary costume, moving through a small room full of people who had paid or been invited to watch. She was not, it should be noted, a virtuoso dancer by the standards of classical technique. She had never been formally trained in European ballet or in any Asian classical tradition. What she had was physical intelligence, an instinctive understanding of how movement reads, how rhythm creates anticipation, how the body can be used to create mood and suggestion without acrobatic display. She was performing a version of what she had observed in Java, filtered through her own sensibility and recalibrated for European audiences who wouldn't have known the difference anyway. The resulting style was slow, sinuous, dramatically lit, and heavy with jeweled symbolism. When critics called it hypnotic, they were describing something real about the viewing experience, even if the tradition she claimed to represent was almost entirely invented. The men who became her patrons during these years were numerous, and their prominence has made her biography simultaneously vivid and difficult to reconstruct with precision, because several of them had strong professional reasons to ensure their association with her was not documented too carefully. What the historical record reveals is a consistent pattern. She attracted men of wealth and power. She received from them not just money but information, the natural atmospheric intelligence of pillow talk, the things powerful men say when their guard is down and they want to seem important to someone who impresses them. She stored this information the way she had stored the Javanese dances, as material that might eventually be useful. Among the documented patrons of her peak years were Felix Rousseau, a prominent banker, Alfred Kiepert, a Prussian magnate from a wealthy Westphalian family who kept her in considerable style, a succession of French military officers of various ranks, German officers including several attached to the Kaiser's court, and a range of diplomats and businessmen whose names appear in various court documents and memoirs. The crucial point for what would come later is that her social circle was not confined to a single nationality. She moved fluently in French, Dutch, German, English, and Spanish social worlds, and she was comfortable in all of them. She had the particular social intelligence of someone who grew up acutely aware that status is performed and can therefore be performed in multiple registers. Her personal life during these years was expensive, deliberately so. She rented apartments in Paris's most fashionable districts, first in Neuilly-sur-Seine, later in the 16th arrondissement. She kept horses because riding had always pleased her and because the sight of her on horseback in the Bois de Boulogne was the kind of image that generated stories. She filled her rooms with flowers and lit them with the careful attention to atmosphere that she brought to everything she controlled. She dressed with theatrical exactitude. Her daytime clothes were as precisely chosen as her stage costumes, and she moved through Paris in a way that suggested the performance was continuous, that there was no offstage Mata Hari, only the persona in different lighting. She traveled across Europe freely, sometimes following opportunities and sometimes following men. She appeared in Berlin multiple times and developed significant relationships there in the years before the war. This fact would later be used against her, though in the world of 1907 or 1908, a woman who performed in Berlin, Vienna, and Paris within the same season was simply a successful international artist. Europe's capital cities were interconnected in the confident, pre-catastrophe way of a continent that had not yet imagined what it was about to do to itself. The Mata Hari narrative was not without its complications, even in those prosperous years. From relatively early in her public life, there were voices suggesting that the exotic biography was not authentic. Journalists who had done their research pointed out inconsistencies. A Dutch reporter named Thomas Bowes published an article in 1905 suggesting that the mysterious Javanese dancer was actually a Dutch woman named Zelle. The article created a small stir and then was largely absorbed by the machine of celebrity mythology, because audiences in 1905 were not especially invested in biographical accuracy for their entertainers. People wanted the dream. The question of whether the dream was literally true was a less interesting question than whether it was convincingly told. She responded to the occasional challenge by adjusting her story rather than abandoning it. When pressed by someone who seemed genuinely skeptical, she might allow a partial confession. Yes, she had spent time in the Indies, yes, she had learned some things there that she incorporated into her performances. But the sacred dancer identity, the temple origins, the Brahmin father, these she defended with practiced certainty, and the certainty generally carried the day with audiences who preferred to believe. The years between 1905 and 1912 represent the peak of what she had built. She was, for those years, genuinely famous in the way that very few individual performers became famous in the pre-mass media era. Her name appeared in newspapers across Europe, she received fan mail from strangers, she was photographed repeatedly by the leading portrait photographers of the time, and her image circulated in the form of postcards, a technology that had just made celebrity images accessible to ordinary people who couldn't afford prints. The postcards show her in her performance costume, in various degrees of undress that the era's postal authorities apparently accepted, and in a number of studio portraits that display the carefully constructed image she had developed, dark, dramatic, serene, and suggestively foreign. But by 1912 and into 1913, the machinery of the career was showing signs of strain. She was in her mid-30s, which in the context of early 20th century performance culture meant she was entering the years when a woman's physical appeal began its managed decline in the cultural imagination. Younger performers were arriving. The novelty of the persona had been in circulation for nearly a decade. Audiences who had found the concept thrilling in 1905 were somewhat less easily thrilled by the same concept in 1913. She was still engaging, still able to command personal attention from the men she chose, but the automatic sensation that had attended her early performances was no longer guaranteed. She needed a new direction, or a new patron substantial enough to make the question of career trajectory moot. She was looking. That was the condition of her life in the summer of 1914, when the world she had been building her existence inside came apart with an abruptness that surprised everyone. The Archduke died in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, and the cascade of alliances and ultimatums that followed moved with terrible mechanical logic toward a general European war that most governments had been simultaneously dreading and planning for. By August 4th, Germany was at war with France. Britain had entered the conflict. The Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary were drawn in on different sides. The continent that had supported Mata Hari's career, that had paid her fees and cheered her performances and filled her salons in Paris and Berlin and Vienna and Madrid, was about to tear itself apart in the most destructive conflict in human history. The beautiful era was over. In its place, something vast and violent and entirely unfamiliar to anyone who had lived only in peacetime. Mata Hari was in Berlin when the war came. The city was about to become the capital of an enemy nation. And her story was about to enter a completely different and far more dangerous chapter. Berlin in August 1914 was a city in the grip of a collective delirium that the Germans themselves would later call Kriegsbegeisterung, war enthusiasm. The declaration of war against France had been met with crowds filling the Unter den Linden, singing patriotic songs and pressing forward to catch a glimpse of the Kaiser on the balcony of the Berlin Palace. Young men had lined up at recruitment offices with expressions that mixed sincere patriotism with a kind of relief, as if the anticipation of conflict had been more wearing than the prospect of it. The mood in the city was not yet the grim, rationed determination of a long war. It was the mood of a people who expected a quick, victorious campaign and were already rehearsing their triumph. Mata Hari was at her Berlin apartment when the mobilization notices went up and the machinery of war began to move. She held Dutch nationality, which meant she was technically a citizen of a neutral nation. The Netherlands had been neutral in the Franco-Prussian War and intended to remain so in this one too. But Dutch neutrality did not immediately translate into freedom of movement. Berlin was a German city putting itself on a wartime footing with the efficiency of a military culture that had been planning for exactly this scenario for years. Foreign nationals were watched. Bank accounts held in German financial institutions were subject to wartime regulations. The connections that had made Mata Hari's Berlin years comfortable, the officers she knew, the patrons she had cultivated, the social access she had earned, were instantly reclassified by the fact of the war. Her German bank account was frozen. This was not a minor inconvenience. She had been living on the generous, irregular income of a high-end courtesan and performer for nearly a decade, and she had not been especially systematic about saving. The expensive lifestyle that formed part of her professional image, the apartments, the clothes, the horses, required continuous incoming funds, and those funds had just been cut off at the German end with no warning. She managed to leave Berlin in the weeks following the outbreak of war, traveling through Switzerland and eventually making her way back to Paris. She arrived in a city that was itself being transformed by the proximity of a front that had stabilized, bloodily and at terrible cost, along a line that ran from the English Channel through Belgium and into northeastern France. The first months of the war had already destroyed the optimistic timeline that both sides had anticipated. The German Schlieffen Plan, which had been intended to knock France out of the war in 6 weeks through a sweeping invasion through Belgium, had been stopped at the Marne in September 1914. The war would not end by Christmas. It might not end for years. Paris was changed. The cafes were still open, the theaters still operating, the social world of the city still visible beneath the surface. But the men who had filled her salons were now in uniform, deployed to fronts whose names were appearing in the newspapers with increasing regularity, names like Verdun and the Somme that would become synonymous with industrial slaughter. Her social world had been militarized along with everything else. She adapted because adaptation was the fundamental skill of her life. She continued to find wealthy patrons, now drawn primarily from the ranks of officers who rotated between the front and Paris on leave, and from the diplomatic and governmental world that remained active in the capital. She performed occasionally, though the large theatrical entertainments of the pre-war years were harder to stage and the appetite for elaborate spectacle had shifted with the mood of the city. She moved between Paris and Madrid and The Hague, using her neutral Dutch passport to cross borders that were being progressively tightened against most people. The Netherlands, which remained neutral throughout the war, was a hub of a specific kind of wartime activity. Neutral nations served as channels for communication, for commerce, for intelligence. Every major power maintained substantial operations in The Hague and Amsterdam, and the density of agents, informants, intermediaries, and double dealers concentrated in the Netherlands during the years 1914 to 1918 was remarkable even by the standards of wartime espionage. The people who moved freely between Paris and The Hague, of whom Mata Hari was one, by virtue of her Dutch passport, were precisely the kind of individuals that intelligence services on all sides were interested in either recruiting or monitoring. It was in this context that a man named Karl Kromer entered her story, though the exact circumstances of their meeting and the nature of the approach he made have been described in slightly different terms by different sources. Kromer was the German consul in Amsterdam. He had a role that, in wartime, overlapped extensively with intelligence functions. Consulates in neutral countries served as the operational infrastructure for intelligence gathering, and Kromer was a German official in a strategically important neutral capital, which meant that part of his job was identifying and developing potential intelligence assets. The meeting between Kromer and Mata Hari appears to have taken place in late 1915 or early 1916, when she was in The Hague. Kromer's approach, by her later account during French interrogations, was relatively direct. He offered her 20,000 francs. In exchange, he asked her to gather information about the Allied military and political situation, using her access to French officers, politicians, and diplomats to collect whatever she could learn that might be of use to German intelligence. She told the French interrogators years later that she had accepted the money but had never intended to actually do anything in return for it. She said she regarded it as fair compensation for the German bank account that had been frozen when the war started, a kind of restitution for the financial losses she had suffered when Germany's wartime banking regulations cut off her funds. This explanation has the quality of something constructed after the fact. It is too convenient, too exactly calibrated to minimize her legal culpability. But whether or not the reasoning she offered was genuine, the basic fact is not in dispute. She took the 20,000 francs. Cromer also gave her, by some accounts, 2 small bottles containing what he described as secret invisible ink, a chemical formula that could be used to write covert messages in invisible script that would only become visible when treated with the appropriate developer compound. She testified that she threw the bottles away without using them. Whether this is true is uncertain. What is certain is that German military intelligence formally enrolled her as an agent at this point, assigning her the code designation H21. The H prefix was used in the German intelligence filing system for agents operating in France, and the number 21 placed her in a specific operational category. The designation H21 would appear later in intercepted German radio communications, and its appearance in those communications would be one of the central pieces of evidence used to convict her. The section of German military intelligence responsible for espionage and counterespionage was technically known as Abteilung 3B, reporting to the German Great General Staff. By 1915 and 1916, this organization had been substantially expanded from its pre-war structure to manage the enormously increased requirements of wartime intelligence operations. It ran agents in France, Britain, Russia, and the neutral countries using multiple communication channels, couriers, coded letters through officially sanctioned commercial mail, and, increasingly, radio transmissions in cipher. The radio operation was both the most technically sophisticated and the most vulnerable component of the German intelligence system. Encrypted radio messages could be intercepted by Allied listening stations, and the cryptanalysts of Britain and France were working continuously to crack the German cipher systems. Mata Hari probably did not know any of this, or not much of it. She knew she had been given a code name and a sum of money and a vague set of expectations. Whether she understood the full operational context she had entered, the encryption systems, the surveillance apparatus, the specific threat that radio intercepts posed to anyone identified in a German intelligence transmission, is unclear. Intelligence recruits in that era were not routinely briefed on the technical details of the systems they were part of. You were given your instructions and your resources, and you were expected to produce results. The question of what results she actually produced or attempted to produce is one of the central disputed points in the historical debate about her case. The French prosecution would later claim that she passed significant military intelligence to the Germans. The available evidence, examined by historians with access to the relevant files, suggests a more ambiguous picture. She gathered some information through social contact. She almost certainly reported impressions and observations from her conversations with French officers, but the intelligence she passed appears to have been either already known to the Germans through other channels or too vague and general to constitute the kind of high-value intelligence that could materially affect the conduct of the war. What she had done, regardless of the intelligence value of her activities, was a serious thing. She had accepted money from a hostile intelligence service. She had a code designation in a German filing system. In a world at war, these facts had weight, and the weight would come down on her at a moment when France was desperate enough to make an example, true or otherwise. But in the winter of 1915 and into 1916, the consequences were not yet visible. She was a woman with a German code name on one side of the ledger and a large sum of money in her purse, moving between Paris and Madrid and The Hague with the ease that her Dutch passport still afforded her. The war that had disrupted her career was also, she was beginning to see, creating a new kind of opportunity. Intelligence services paid. Both sides needed people who could cross borders and talk to powerful men and report back what those men said in their unguarded moments. The question was whether there was a way to work both sides, to serve France as earnestly as she had agreed to serve Germany, and to profit from the arrangement twice. It was an ambitious idea. It was also, as she was about to learn, exactly the kind of idea that gets people killed. France, in the spring of 1916, was a country being bled white. The Battle of Verdun had begun on February 21st of that year, initiated by General Erich von Falkenhayn with the stated intention of inflicting casualties on the French army at a rate that France could not sustain, an industrial strategy of attrition in which the objective was not territory but the exhaustion of human life. By the time the battle finally concluded in December, both sides had suffered approximately 700,000 casualties combined, killed, missing, or wounded. An entire generation of young French and German men was being ground into the chalk hills of the Meuse River Valley before breakfast, while their generals deliberated over maps in farmhouses miles from the sound of the guns. In Paris, the war was simultaneously everywhere and strangely muffled. The newspapers ran the casualty figures, but they ran them in the language of official communiques that described advances and positions rather than bodies. The cafes operated with somewhat reduced hours. The theaters were open. Women moved through the city in black with increasing frequency, the visible arithmetic of grief accumulating in the way women's clothing tracks a nation's losses. Soldiers on leave from the front filled certain neighborhoods with a specific mood, not celebration exactly, but the urgent, compressed vitality of people who had been very close to death and needed to remind themselves they were still alive. The intelligence services of France, the Duxim Bureau, the military counterintelligence branch, and related agencies were operating under enormous pressure. The war had created both an explosion in the volume of intelligence work required and a simultaneous drain on the experienced personnel available to do that work. Men who had spent years developing expertise in surveillance, cryptanalysis, and agent management were now sometimes being pulled into military service or killed in it. The organizations that remained were stretched thin, working with incomplete information, making judgments in conditions of considerable uncertainty. Within this context, a man named Georges Ledoux had been appointed to run the counterintelligence and recruitment section responsible for French agents working in hostile or neutral territory. Ledoux was a career military officer, a captain by rank, who had developed his intelligence skills in the years before the war and had been attached to the service in various capacities since the early fighting. He was intelligent, methodical, and deeply suspicious by professional formation, the kind of man who read multiple meanings into simple statements and preferred to learn things about people rather than be told them. His office was on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, in one of the anonymous buildings that housed the French state's more discreet operations, and his days consisted of interviews with potential agents, assessments of intelligence reports, and the constant management of a roster of sources whose reliability he could never fully verify. Ledoux had been aware of Mata Hari for some time before she walked into his office in the autumn of 1916 and proposed that France hire her as a spy. She was not unknown to French intelligence. A woman who moved freely between neutral and belligerent countries and maintained close social relationships with senior military officers on multiple sides was exactly the kind of person that the Duxim Bureau kept a file on. Whether that file already contained any information connecting her to Karl Kromer or to the German intelligence designation H-21 is disputed in the historical record. Some accounts suggest Ledoux knew or strongly suspected her German connection before she walked in. Others maintain that the evidence came later, from the radio intercepts, and that Ledoux's suspicions were initially based on less specific grounds. What is not disputed is the meeting itself. Mata Hari approached Ledoux directly, presenting herself as willing and able to gather intelligence for France using her access to German and Austro-Hungarian officers. She made the pitch in the way she made most presentations, confidently, with the personal authority she had been cultivating for years. She told Ledoux that she had contacts at the highest levels of German military and diplomatic circles. She suggested that she could, if properly supported, obtain information of significant strategic value. She named a figure 1 million francs for intelligence worth having. The amount was extraordinary. French intelligence agents typically worked for modest monthly fees, with occasional bonuses for exceptional results. 1 million francs was a sum that reflected either genuine confidence in the quality of what she could deliver or a fundamental misunderstanding of the economics of the intelligence market she was proposing to enter. Ledoux did not immediately agree, which is unsurprising. He listened. He asked questions. He assessed the woman in front of him with the professional evaluation of someone who spent his working life trying to determine whether what he was being told was true. What Ledoux made of Mata Hari in that first meeting has been analyzed and debated by historians at length. His own memoirs, written after the war, present him as having been suspicious from the start, a canny intelligence officer who recognized a double agent and managed her accordingly. But memoirs written by intelligence officers about their own wartime service are not always the most reliable primary sources. They are frequently constructed with the benefit of hindsight and the organizing principle of making the author look more prescient than they actually were. The question of when exactly Ledoux knew what he knew, and what he did with that knowledge, is one of the crucial unanswered elements of the Mata Hari case. What he did, in the immediate aftermath of that first meeting, was agree to consider her proposal. He had her followed. He gathered what additional information he could about her movements and contacts. And eventually he agreed to take her on, though on terms that were considerably less defined than the 1 million franc arrangement she had proposed. He gave her a general mandate to develop intelligence from her German contacts and told her to proceed towards Spain, where the German intelligence operation was known to be active, as a starting point for her mission. There is a question embedded in this arrangement that historians have never fully resolved. Did Ledoux intend to use Mata Hari as a genuine intelligence asset? Or did he intend to use her as bait? The distinction matters enormously. If he believed she could gather real intelligence, then his subsequent handling of the case was simply incompetent. If he was running a carefully managed operation in which he deliberately exposed her to German contacts in order to observe and ultimately compromise those contacts, then her arrest and prosecution were a feature of his strategy rather than a discovery made in the course of it. Ledoux left no fully clarifying evidence on this point, and historians have argued both interpretations with passion and plausible supporting evidence. What we can say is that Mata Hari left that meeting on Boulevard Saint-Germain with a new identity as a French intelligence asset and an assignment that was both genuinely dangerous and, in several important respects, poorly designed. She had not been given training in tradecraft or operational security. She had not been provided with a secure communications channel. She had been told to go to Spain and develop information about German activities there, and to report back whatever she found. The operational infrastructure that professional agents require, the handlers, the dead drops, the fallback procedures, the extraction plans, was either absent or so vague as to be functionally absent. She also had not told Ledoux about Karl Kromer and the 20,000 francs and the code designation H21. This omission was, in retrospect, the most consequential decision of her life, because it meant she was now managing two intelligence relationships simultaneously, each one unaware of the other, and the secrecy required to maintain that position was a permanent vulnerability, a structural weakness in her situation that would remain there for as long as the war continued. She was a double agent in the most basic definition of the term, receiving payment from one intelligence service while claiming to work for another. Whether she ever seriously intended to perform intelligence operations for both sides simultaneously, or whether she intended to perform them for France alone and simply pocket the German money she had already accepted, is something that cannot be determined from the surviving evidence with certainty. Her own statements varied across different audiences and different moments of her testimony. There is no single coherent account of her intentions that explains all the evidence without leaving something unexplained. What there is, instead, is a life at an inflection point. She was 40 years old in the autumn of 1916. The career that had defined her for a decade was effectively over. The Belle Époque audiences who had made her famous were scattered across battlefields and grieving households, and the theatrical world that had been her stage was not coming back in the same form. The wealthy patrons were fewer and older and more cautious. The great performances in Madrid and Vienna and Berlin were part of a world that existed only in the past. But she was not ready to be finished. She had always found the next door when the previous one closed. She had created herself once from almost nothing, and she believed, with the particular confidence of someone who had survived what she had survived, that she could do it again. Intelligence work paid. Provided a purpose. It connected her to the great events of the era in a way that felt appropriate to a woman who had spent 20 years at the center of things. She had agreed to spy for Germany. She had agreed to spy for France. She was in possession of the German codename H21, the French agreement on terms, and a Dutch passport that still gave her access to the neutral territories in between. The situation was extremely precarious. She was, in the language that intelligence professionals use, dramatically overexposed, operating without proper tradecraft, without institutional support, without the network of backup and verification that professional agents use to survive. The only things she had were her intelligence, her personal confidence, and the contacts she had spent 20 years cultivating. It had been enough before. She reasoned it would be enough now. She was reasoning incorrectly, and the events that would demonstrate this were already in motion, in the cipher room of a German radio station, in the analytical desks of French cryptanalysis, in the internal deliberations of an intelligence officer on the Boulevard Saint-Germain who was not quite telling her everything he knew. There is a category of person that intelligence services in every era simultaneously prize and distrust. The gifted amateur. Professional intelligence officers, the ones trained by institutions, shaped by doctrine, evaluated by superiors who understand the craft, view amateurs who wander into the intelligence world with a mixture of contempt and calculation. The contempt is earned partly by the amateur's absence of tradecraft and partly by their characteristic tendency to overestimate their own abilities in an arena where overestimation has lethal consequences. The calculation follows from the recognition that amateurs sometimes have access that professionals can't replicate. Social connections, cover stories, personal charm, and can therefore be useful precisely because they don't look like spies. Mata Hari was emphatically in this category. She was extraordinarily well-connected, genuinely comfortable in the presence of powerful men, fluent in the social codes of multiple national elites, and completely without training in the operational security that would have made any of those assets deployable in a sustained and reliable way. She had charm and she had history with people who mattered. She did not have the discipline that keeps amateurs alive. The operation that Ledoux had outlined was ostensibly straightforward. She was to travel to Spain via Britain, make contact with German intelligence operatives or German-connected officers in Madrid, gather whatever information she could, and report back to France. Spain was a neutral country and a significant operational theater. Both German and Allied intelligence services maintained large, active operations there, and the German attaché network in Madrid was known to be directing a range of activities against the Allies. If Mata Hari could penetrate that network, using her personal connections and her established reputation in German military circles, the intelligence value could be real. She booked passage on a ship from France to Britain, the first leg of the journey to Spain. This is where the operation immediately began to unravel. When her ship arrived at the port of Falmouth on the Cornish coast in November 1916, British security services were waiting. This was not unusual. The British were methodical and thorough in their examination of passengers arriving at British ports from continental Europe, particularly those whose backgrounds included significant contact with German nationals. Mata Hari's background included exactly this. She was taken off the ship, detained, and transported to London. Her interrogation at Scotland Yard was conducted by a senior official named Basil Thompson, who served as Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and was simultaneously one of the leading figures in British wartime counterintelligence. Thompson was experienced, shrewd, and accustomed to listening to what people said while paying more attention to what they chose not to say. He interviewed Mata Hari over the course of several hours. She made a decision during that interview that illustrates both her courage and her misjudgment. Rather than maintain the cover of a neutral civilian traveling for personal reasons, which would have been the standard tradecraft response to detention, she told Thompson that she was a French agent. She explained her arrangement with Ledoux. She provided details that were essentially accurate about her relationship with French intelligence. This was in some respects understandable. She was trapped, she had no operational cover to fall back on, and the claim to be working for the Allies seemed like the obvious way out of British detention. But it was operationally ruinous. She had compromised her French handler to a foreign intelligence service without authorization. She had confirmed her intelligence work to a third-party service in circumstances that Thompson could not independently verify. And she had demonstrated, for anyone paying close attention, that when detained and pressured, she would disclose sensitive operational information rather than maintain silence. Thompson was not certain what to make of her. His subsequent correspondence and memoirs suggest he found her story plausible in some respects and implausible in others, and he was unwilling to release her without further verification. He eventually made inquiries to French intelligence, which, either deliberately or through bureaucratic confusion, initially disavowed any knowledge of her. This put Thompson in the position of holding a woman who claimed to be a French agent and had just been told by France that she was not. He eventually concluded that she was more likely a German agent than a French one, but he had no immediate evidence specific enough for a prosecution, and she was a Dutch national, which complicated the legal picture. He released her, with the strong suggestion that she return directly to Spain and not proceed further into Britain. What Thompson knew that Mata Hari did not know, what she almost certainly could not have known, was that British and French signals intelligence had already been reading German-coded radio communications with significant success. The Zimmermann telegram would be decoded and disclosed to the Americans in early 1917, demonstrating the extent of Allied cryptanalytic capabilities. Within the universe of German intelligence communications being intercepted and analyzed, the designation H-21 had already appeared. The significance of this cannot be overstated. The Germans were using a cipher system for their Madrid to Berlin radio communications that Allied cryptanalysts had cracked. Every message that German intelligence in Madrid transmitted to headquarters in Berlin was potentially being read in Paris and London. If the Germans were going to communicate about Mata Hari using her code designation, those communications could be read by the people she was ostensibly working for. She proceeded to Spain after her release from British custody. She arrived in Madrid in late 1916, and there she made the contact that would seal whatever remaining chance she had of surviving the situation she had created. She met with Major Arnold Colley, the German military attaché in Madrid. Colley was a professional German intelligence officer stationed at the Madrid embassy, responsible for coordinating German intelligence operations and maintaining communications with networks in Spain and France. He operated openly as a military attaché and covertly as an intelligence coordinator, which was the standard arrangement for military attaches in all major embassies of the era. He knew what he was doing. He had been doing it for a long time. The meeting between Mata Hari and Colley was, at least in its surface structure, a meeting between a German intelligence asset H-21 and her German case officer in the field. She met with Colley socially on multiple occasions. She shared a bed with him at least once, by her own later account. And she told him things, impressions about French military morale, general observations about the mood in Paris, information she had gathered from conversations with French officers. The precise nature of what she told Colley is not fully documented, but some of it was later reconstructed from French intelligence files. Here is the critical fact that changed everything. After meeting with Mata Hari, Major Colley sent several radio messages to Berlin. Those messages were transmitted in a German cipher, the same cipher that Allied signals intelligence had already compromised. And those messages referred specifically to Agent H-21, describing her activities and suggesting she had been productive. But before we continue the story, if you're finding yourself drawn into the shadows of this extraordinary life, make sure to hit subscribe to the Dead Drop so you never miss our deep dives into the world's most gripping espionage stories. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The French Signals Intelligence Service intercepted those messages. The cryptanalysts decoded them, and the name H-21 was now firmly, documentably linked, in a recovered German communication to Mata Hari, the woman who had simultaneously told Ledoux she was working for France. What followed that discovery is a question that has divided historians. Some argue that France now had legitimate, documentary grounds for treating her as a German spy. The German radio messages provided genuine evidence that she was reporting to German intelligence. Others point out that the messages Kali sent were almost certainly not what they appeared to be. Kali was a professional intelligence officer who knew, or should have known, that the cipher he was using could potentially be compromised. He was also an officer operating in a city, Madrid, that was saturated with Allied surveillance. The suggestion, made seriously by several historians, is that Kali deliberately sent those H-21 messages knowing they would be intercepted, that he was, in effect, burning Mata Hari by exposing her to French counterintelligence, either because she was no longer useful to Germany, or because he had concluded she was a French plant, or simply because exposing her served German interests better than protecting her. If Kali deliberately burned her, then the intercepted radio messages were not evidence of her espionage. They were a coordinated operation by German intelligence to destroy a woman whom the Germans had either decided to sacrifice or had determined was working against them. The French, reading the messages, would have been consuming intelligence that the Germans had specifically crafted for them to find. This is not a peripheral theoretical possibility. It is one of the most carefully argued positions in the scholarly literature on the case, and it casts a very different light on what the French court would later describe as definitive proof of her guilt. Intelligence services throughout history have used precisely this technique, feeding compromised channels with deliberately placed disinformation, and the circumstances of the Kali messages fit the pattern with uncomfortable accuracy. Whether she was burned deliberately by Germany, used and discarded by Ledoux, or genuinely running a double operation that the French legitimately uncovered, Mata Hari left Madrid in early 1917 without fully understanding how much her situation had deteriorated in the weeks she had been in Spain. She was carrying the impression of progress. She had made contact with Kali. She had gathered some information. She had material to report back to Ledoux. She did not know that, in the cipher rooms of French military intelligence, a decision had already been made. She was on her way back to Paris, still believing, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has survived on confidence alone for most of their adult life, that the situation could be managed, that she could explain, that there was still a version of this story in which she came out intact on the other side. She would arrive in Paris to find that version was no longer available. Before she returned to Paris from Madrid, something happened in Mata Hari's private life that changed the emotional weight of everything that followed. It is important to understand this because the court proceedings and the historical narrative have frequently treated her as a purely political figure, a chess piece in the espionage game between France and Germany, when in reality she was also a woman in her early 40s who had fallen in love or something very close to it, and who was making decisions shaped partly by that emotional reality. His name was Vadim Maslov. He was a Russian officer serving with the Russian Expeditionary Force in France, one of the contingents of Russian troops who had been deployed to the Western Front as part of the alliance obligations between France and Russia. He was considerably younger than Mata Hari, 21 or 22 years old, depending on the account, which made him approximately 20 years her junior, and he was, by all surviving descriptions, handsome in the particular way that young military men cultivated in that era. Dark hair, straight bearing, a directness of manner that came from both his training and his temperament. They met in Paris sometime in 1916, at one of the social functions that served the dual purpose of entertainment and connection for officers on leave. He was captivated almost immediately. She responded with a warmth that her later correspondence suggests was not purely calculated. The letters she wrote about Maslov during this period have a different quality from the letters she wrote about other men, less managed, less concerned with effect, more genuinely agitated by the uncertainty about whether he cared for her. She had spent 20 years being the object of other people's desire, the one who wielded the power in social and romantic transactions. With Maslov, something different seemed to be at work. She wanted his specific attention, his particular regard, and the wanting made her vulnerable. By the autumn of 1916, Maslov had been sent back to the front. He was wounded in combat sometime in October or November. The wound was to his eyes, which affected his vision and was serious enough to require extended medical treatment. When word reached Mata Hari that he had been wounded, she made an urgent request to Ledoux. She wanted to be permitted to travel to the front, to the zone where Maslov was being treated, to see him. The front was a restricted military zone. Civilian access required specific authorization that French intelligence could grant or deny. Ledoux's response was calculated. He told her that he could not simply give her a pass to the front as a personal favor. If she wanted that access, she would need to earn it through results. He had an assignment for her. She was to proceed to Belgium, specifically to the area around Brussels, and make contact with a high-value German intelligence target. Several accounts named the intended target as the Duke of Brunswick, who was connected to the German Crown Prince's entourage, though the specific assignment varies slightly depending on the source. The point was the same. To get access to the front to see Maslov, she would first need to demonstrate her value to French intelligence by completing a concrete mission in German-occupied Belgium. This assignment was, as several historians have noted, almost certainly impossible to execute. Belgium was German-occupied territory. Moving through occupied Belgium without proper cover, attempting to make contact with a senior figure in the German military hierarchy, required resources, preparation, cover documentation, and operational support that Mata Hari simply did not have. A professional agent preparing for such a mission would have spent months in preparation, developing a cover identity, establishing a plausible reason for being in the occupied zone, memorizing a legend in detail. Mata Hari had none of this. She had a Dutch passport and her social ingenuity. Whether Ledoux gave her this assignment because he believed she might accomplish it, or because he was testing her, or because he was managing her toward a confrontation he had already decided to arrange, is one of those questions the surviving evidence cannot definitively resolve. The assignment was either a genuine operational request or a trap constructed with plausible deniability. The result was the same. She couldn't complete it. She went to Spain instead, which is where the meetings with Kali occurred. The intelligence she gathered there, German officers' names, information about German submarine operations in the Mediterranean, details about German-funded rebellions in Morocco and other French North African territories. She reported back to Ledoux on her return to Paris in early January 1917. The intelligence about Morocco was, by some accounts, not entirely trivial. The Germans were indeed sponsoring unrest in French colonial territory through their networks in Tangier and Ceuta, and any specific details about those networks had potential operational value. But Ledoux's response to her report was cold and non-committal. He seemed unimpressed. He raised questions about why she had not completed the Belgium mission. He did not pay her. In her later accounts of this period, she described being confused and frustrated by Ledoux's attitude. She had done what she could with what she had. She had brought back real information, and his response was withdrawal where she had expected engagement. Looking back on this with the benefit of what happened next, it seems increasingly clear that Ledoux was no longer interested in the content of her reports. He was interested in building a case. The intercepted Kali radio messages had confirmed, for him, that she had met with German intelligence and was reportable to Germany under the H-21 designation. The content of those messages, which described her as an agent reporting useful information, was, in the French intelligence view, evidence of espionage regardless of whether she had subsequently reported the same information to France. The situation she had placed herself in, the double arrangement working for both sides simultaneously, was legally and morally untenable once discovered. Under French military law, providing assistance to the enemy during wartime was a capital offense. The question of whether she had actually provided significant military information that damaged France was, in the strict legal interpretation used by the French military tribunal system, almost beside the point. She had a German code number. She had taken German money. She had met with a German intelligence officer in Madrid and had apparently told him things. That was sufficient. She did not know she was being managed toward arrest during those January 1917 weeks. She was living at the Élysée Palace Hotel on the Rue de Rivoli, one of the Grande Dame establishments of the Right Bank that maintained an air of Edwardian luxury even as the war continued its grim accounting a few hundred kilometers away. She was pursuing her social contacts, writing letters to Maslov, continuing to meet with men who could be useful to her and to the French intelligence case that Ledoux was assembling. She had begun to sense that something was wrong, however. She wrote a letter to Ledoux in early 1917 that reflects a growing unease. She noted that she seemed to be followed, that she had been watched, that things were not progressing as she had expected. She asked for a meeting. She asked for her money. She asked for the access pass to Maslov that had been promised. She received evasive responses. The net was already around her. The surveillance team assigned to monitor her movements was filing reports with meticulous regularity, noting every person she met and every place she went. She was meeting Senator Jean Clunet, who was a legal professional. She was meeting a Frenchman named Halor who had known her for years. She was, in the view of the investigators who were documenting her movements, doing exactly what a confident agent does when she doesn't know she's being watched, continuing to operate with the assumption that the situation is manageable, right up until the moment it isn't. The January days in Paris that year were cold and gray, the winter light thin and without warmth. The city had been at war for 2.5 years. There was no champagne in the quantity that the hotels had served before the war. There were fewer flowers. The young men were at the front or under the earth. The women who had been their companions moved through the city's remaining social life with the particular attention of people who have learned not to take anything for granted. Mata Hari moved through it with her characteristic confidence, which was by now a reflex as much as a choice. The mask she had put on in 1905 had been worn for so long that it had become, in most moments, indistinguishable from the face beneath. She was 40 years old. She had been performing, in one form or another, for her entire adult life. She had been a colonel's wife in the East Indies and a sacred dancer in Paris and a courtesan to half the powerful men of Europe and, now, an agent claimed by both sides of a world war. She had crossed every border she had ever confronted by being, simply, more herself than any situation expected. She was about to discover that there are borders that don't yield to personality. That French military law in 1917 was a structure that her presence could not change and her charm could not soften. That the process that had been set in motion, in cipher rooms and intelligence offices and surveillance reports and memoranda flowing between desks on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, was not a social situation. It was machinery, and machinery, once started, runs to its conclusion regardless of who is standing in the way. The conclusion was approximately 2 weeks away. The morning of February 13th, 1917 arrived at the Élysée Palace Hotel with the particular quiet of a morning that has been planned in advance. The Rue de Rivoli stretched in its long stone line outside, the bare trees of the Tuileries gardens visible through the windows, and the hotel went about its early routines with the unhurried professionalism of an establishment that had been serving guests for decades and expected to serve them for decades more. Luggage moved. Breakfast was laid. Fires were tended. An ordinary beginning to an ordinary Paris winter morning. At approximately 9 in the morning, a group of men arrived at the hotel. They were not in uniform. They wore the standard dark suits of official business, and they moved with the compressed efficiency of people who had been briefed beforehand and knew exactly where they were going. A police inspector named Jules Gaubet led the group. He had a warrant. He knew the room number. In her room, Mata Hari had been awake for some time. Whether she heard them coming or was taken completely by surprise when the knock on her door came is not recorded with certainty. What is recorded is that she came to the door, saw the men, and was informed that she was under arrest on the charge of espionage against France. She was given time to dress. She was allowed to collect some belongings. She was then escorted out of the hotel and into the waiting vehicle, past the lobby where the hotel staff watched with the mixture of shock and the instinct not to stare that good hotel staff always maintain. She was taken to the military prison of Saint-Lazare. Saint-Lazare was not primarily a military installation. It was a women's prison in the 10th arrondissement, a grim stone building that had housed prisoners of various kinds for more than 2 centuries. In 1917, it also served as the detention facility for women accused of espionage against France, which is the specific category in which Mata Hari now found herself. The cell she was assigned was small, adequately furnished by prison standards but entirely removed from the style of life she had been living for 2 decades. The windows were high and barred. The sounds of the prison, footsteps on stone, the mechanical rhythm of the institution, replaced the ambient noise of hotel corridors and Parisian streets. She had been, for the first 24 hours, probably still operating under some version of the conviction that this would be resolved. She had an explanation. She was a French agent. She could prove it by citing Ledoux, by describing their arrangement, by offering the names of the contacts she had developed. This had been her mode of operation for too long to abandon immediately. When confronted with a problem, apply confidence and clarity and the force of personality, and the situation will shift. But the machinery she was now inside was not responsive to confident explanations. The man assigned to interrogate her was Captain Pierre Bouchardon. He was a military investigating magistrate, which in the French legal system of 1917 meant he served a role that combined elements of prosecutor, investigator, and judge in the pretrial phase of a military case. He was 50 years old, a lawyer by training who had transferred to military service at the outbreak of the war and had handled a number of espionage cases since. He was methodical, patient, and entirely unmoved by personal charm in professional settings, a quality that made him well suited for exactly this kind of assignment. Bouchardon's approach to the interrogations, which began within days of her arrest and continued across many sessions over the following months, was systematic. He did not confront her with the totality of the case against her. He asked questions. He listened to her answers. He cross-referenced what she told him against the documentary evidence he had assembled and against what other witnesses and informants had told him. He came back the following session with follow-up questions that reflected the places where her previous answers hadn't quite held up. He was, in short, doing exactly what a competent interrogator does, creating a detailed factual record that the prosecution could use and that the defense would struggle to explain away. The interrogation sessions produced hundreds of pages of transcribed testimony. She answered at length. She was not the kind of person who sits silently and declines to engage, and her answers were sometimes remarkably forthcoming and sometimes so elaborately constructed that their complexity itself became a form of evidence. She admitted to meeting Cromer. She admitted to taking the 20,000 francs, but offered the explanation that it was restitution for her frozen German bank account rather than advance payment for intelligence services. She admitted to meeting Kali in Madrid. She described the information she had provided to Ledoux. She insisted, consistently and with the kind of detailed elaboration that suggests genuine conviction rather than simple denial, that she had never passed information to Germany that could have damaged France. The admission that she had taken Cromer's money was damaging. Under French military law, receiving payment from a hostile intelligence service was itself a criminal act, separate from and prior to the question of whether she had actually transmitted useful military information. The prosecution did not need to prove that France was damaged by her actions. It needed to prove that she had entered into an intelligence relationship with Germany, and the 20,000 francs provided documented evidence of exactly that. Her counterargument, that the money was essentially a restitution payment she had accepted in bad faith, intending never to deliver what it was ostensibly purchased for, had the quality of an explanation that might be comprehensible to a civilian court weighing moral nuances in peacetime, but was extraordinarily difficult to present persuasively to a military tribunal in wartime France, where the context was 700,000 dead at Verdun and a country that had been fighting for survival for 2.5 years. There was also the matter of the radio messages. The intercepted Kali transmissions, in which H-21 was described as an active German agent, were presented to her during the interrogations. She responded to them in a way that her lawyers would later find deeply challenging to work with. She could not deny that H-21 referred to her, because Cromer had used that designation. She could not deny that Kali was a German intelligence officer, because he was. She could not deny that they had met. What she could, and did, argue was that the information she gave Kali was either already publicly available or was deliberately designed to mislead him, as part of her assignment for France. This argument had one significant problem. She had not told Ledoux about the Kali meetings before they happened. She had not cleared with French intelligence what she intended to disclose to a known German intelligence officer. From a basic counterintelligence perspective, this was either the behavior of a double agent managing both relationships without telling either side about the other, or it was the behavior of a thoroughly untrained amateur who had not understood the most fundamental operational requirement of her situation. Neither of these interpretations was particularly helpful to her defense. She asked for Ledoux to be called as a witness who could confirm her role as a French agent. Ledoux was questioned by Bouchardon. His response was carefully constructed. He confirmed that Mata Hari had approached him and proposed working for France. He did not confirm that he had authorized a specific mission. He expressed doubt about whether he had given her any formal mandate. He suggested that her activities in Spain, the Kali meetings, the information exchange, had been unauthorized and had, in his view, confirmed his suspicions about her true loyalties. This was, depending on how one reads it, either an honest intelligence officer describing the behavior of a double agent he had been suspicious of from the start, or a man systematically covering himself by disavowing a relationship he had genuinely authorized and then found inconvenient to acknowledge. Ledoux's credibility has been challenged by historians who have examined the timing and content of his statements. The gaps between what he claimed and what the documentary record shows do not always resolve in his favor. The weeks in Saint-Lazare accumulated. Spring came to Paris outside the prison walls, and inside them the rhythm of the inquiry continued. She corresponded with her defense attorney, a man named Edouard Clunet who was a distinguished civil lawyer but had virtually no experience in military criminal cases, a deficiency that would prove catastrophic at trial. She wrote letters to Vadim Maslov, asking for word from him, asking if he was well, asking him to write. The letters were intercepted by prison authorities and reviewed by the prosecution. Most of them reveal an emotional state that oscillates between carefully maintained composure and unmistakable desperation. The desperation not of someone managing a complex intelligence situation, but of a woman in legal and personal trouble who wanted to hear from someone who cared about her. No reply from Maslov appears to have been received. Whether he never wrote or whether his letters were intercepted, or whether he simply chose silence, is something the record does not clearly establish. She maintained her composure in the interrogation sessions with a constancy that Bouchardon noted in his assessments. She was articulate and organized. She did not break down. She did not make dramatic confessions or unsupported accusations. She was, in other words, a difficult witness, not because she was evasive in the blunt sense, but because she was intelligent enough to know what was being constructed around her and composed enough not to be manipulated into providing what the prosecution needed that she hadn't already given. Bouchardon had a case. He was building it carefully, assembling the German payment, the radio messages, the Kali meetings, the false story about her origins, her German bank account, her contacts throughout German military circles, into a structure that would hold together before a tribunal. It was not, the historical record suggests, an airtight case. The intelligence value of what she had passed was genuinely ambiguous. The question of whether the Kali messages were authentic or deliberate German disinformation was never fully examined. The legal standard being applied was broad enough to secure a conviction on the facts already documented, but the moral case, the question of whether this specific woman had done France sufficient harm to warrant execution, was considerably less clear. France in early 1917 was not primarily interested in moral clarity. France in early 1917 was interested in survival, in morale, in the narrative of action against those who threatened it. An exotic foreign woman who had been sleeping with high-ranking officers and talking to German intelligence in neutral capitals was exactly the kind of story that served a wartime government's need to demonstrate vigilance against internal threats. The individual facts of Mata Hari's case were, in this context, almost secondary to the symbolic function she was being asked to perform. She would perform it before a military tribunal in July. To understand what France was willing to believe in the spring and summer of 1917, you need to understand what France was experiencing. The country had been at war for nearly 3 years. More than 1 million French soldiers had been killed since August 1914, before the armistice figures were finally compiled. Entire age cohorts of young men from provincial towns and urban neighborhoods had been fed into the fighting and had not come back. The women who waited for them, mothers, wives, fiancées, sisters, carried a grief that had been accumulating since the first casualties list appeared in the newspapers in the autumn of 1914 and had never stopped. The Nivelle Offensive, launched in April 1917 on the Chemin de Dames Ridge in the Aisne region, had been promoted to the French army and French public as the assault that would finally break the German line, the decisive blow after 3 years of costly stalemate. General Robert Nivelle had promised a breakthrough within 48 hours. What actually happened was a catastrophe. Significant territorial gains were followed by German counterattacks. Casualties exceeded projections by a devastating margin, and the promised breakthrough never came. By late April and into May, significant sections of the French army had mutinied. This is not a word to be used lightly. The French army mutinies of 1917 involved approximately half of the French divisions on the Western Front at their peak. Soldiers who had endured years of brutal frontline service and had been told this offensive would finally end it found themselves, after its failure, simply refusing to participate in more suicidal attacks. They were not fleeing. Most of the mutineers were prepared to hold their defensive positions. What they were refusing was further participation in offensive operations that served no discernible purpose beyond generating casualties. The mutinies were suppressed. The new commander-in-chief, General Philippe Pétain, made significant concessions on leave and conditions while authorizing exemplary courts-martial to demonstrate that the military discipline structure remained intact. The French government managed to keep the scale of the mutinies out of the German press and out of the Allied public narrative until well after the war. But the events created an atmosphere of profound institutional crisis within the French military and government. Morale was fragile. The fear of subversion, of spies, of internal betrayal amplifying the external catastrophe, was acute. In this environment, the Mata Hari case served a specific institutional function that went beyond the legal question of her guilt or innocence. French counterintelligence had, during the preceding years, mounted prosecutions of a number of individuals accused of passing information to the Germans. Some of these prosecutions were well supported by evidence. Others were considerably more questionable. The institutional pressure to demonstrate vigilance, to show that the security services were protecting France against the enemies within, even as the army struggled against the enemies without, was not a neutral backdrop to the legal process. It was an active force shaping the standards by which evidence was evaluated and the fervor with which prosecution was pursued. A woman who had accepted money from German intelligence, met with a German intelligence officer in a neutral country, and could not provide a completely clean account of what she had told him was not going to receive the benefit of the doubt in this environment. The benefit of the doubt had been consumed by the casualties lists. What remained was the requirement for proof, and proof in the context of a wartime military tribunal had a different character than proof in a peacetime civil court. The weeks between the arrest in February and the trial in July were weeks of detailed case preparation by the prosecution and increasingly desperate legal maneuvering by the defense. Edouard Clunet, her attorney, was a distinguished name in French civil law. He had represented major corporations and wealthy clients in complex commercial cases, and he had a warm personal history with Mata Hari that dated back to the early years of her Paris career, when he had been among her patrons. He was 74 years old in 1917. He was not a criminal trial advocate and he had no experience in military law. He was also genuinely motivated to help her, which at least guaranteed personal commitment, but he lacked the technical expertise in military jurisprudence that her case required. Clunet attempted to obtain access to the intercepted German radio messages so that the defense could have them independently analyzed. The prosecution resisted this on grounds of national security. The ciphers and the methodology of their decryption were classified military information. The argument that the messages might be German disinformation rather than genuine evidence of espionage could not be fully developed without access to the technical details of how they were obtained and interpreted, details that the prosecution was not prepared to share with defense counsel. This is, by modern legal standards, a significant due process problem. An accused person's right to confront and examine the evidence against them, including the means by which that evidence was obtained, is a fundamental principle of fair trial procedure. In 1917 France, military tribunals operated under rules that were considerably more favorable to prosecution than to defense. The military legal system had been designed to handle desertion and insubordination, crimes with straightforward factual profiles. Espionage, with its technical complexities and inherently classified evidence base, strained that system in ways that its designers had not anticipated. She continued to write letters during these months. The correspondence that survives reveals a woman maintaining a careful public face while privately struggling with the recognition that her situation was deteriorating. She wrote to Dutch diplomatic officials, asking for their intercession. The Netherlands was neutral, and Dutch nationals faced with criminal prosecution in belligerent countries had some claim on Dutch diplomatic support. The Dutch consul made inquiries. He was told the case was a French military matter, which in practical terms meant there was limited leverage available from outside. She wrote to Clunet with specific suggestions and requests and a detail orientation that suggests she was highly engaged with the legal strategy, not deferring to her attorney but actively thinking through the case herself. Some of her suggestions were good ones. She identified witnesses who could testify to her work for France. She argued for specific documentary requests that might have produced exculpatory evidence. Clunet's ability to execute on these suggestions was limited by his unfamiliarity with military procedure and by the prosecution's success in keeping the classified evidence sealed. She also, during these months, made a decision about what she would not do. She would not name names. Among the common tactics by which defendants in espionage cases sometimes reduced their sentences or generated sympathy, providing information about other agents, cooperating with the investigation in exchange for leniency, turning on the people who had recruited or handled them, she demonstrated a consistent refusal. Some historians have interpreted this as evidence of genuine loyalty to people she worked with. Others have suggested she may simply have recognized that the people she could have named were powerful enough that naming them would have created more enemies than it resolved, without necessarily reducing her sentence. Both interpretations may be partially correct. What is consistent across the sources is that she did not provide the prosecution with information about her contacts and handlers beyond what Boucherton already had. She did not try to trade. She maintained the position that she was a French agent who had been misunderstood, and she maintained it without supplementing it with accusations that might have made it more credible. The spring passed. The French army mutinies were suppressed. The Third Republic's press contained no reports about the mutinies, but well-sourced Paris gossip knew that something had gone badly wrong on the Chemin des Dames, and that the French army was in a more fragile condition than official communiques suggested. The fear of German intelligence penetration, of information leaking to the enemy through the social world of Paris, through the officers who went on leave and talked in restaurants and hotel bars to women they trusted, was sharpened by the fear that internal weakness might be being exploited from outside. In Saint-Lazare, Mata Hari read what books and newspapers she was permitted to receive. She met with Clunet. She wrote her letters. She waited for a response from Maslov that had not come. She turned 41 in August, but by August she was already in the hands of the tribunal. The trial had finally arrived. On July 24, 1917, the doors of the military tribunal room in the Palais de Justice opened for the case of Margaretha Geertruida Zelle, known as Mata Hari, charged with intelligence with the enemy. The summer light fell through the high windows and across the assembly of judges in uniform, the prosecution, the defense, the small audience of authorized observers. The accused was brought in and seated. She had dressed with her characteristic care. She was 41 years old, and she was about to face the court. The military tribunal convened under the presidency of Lieutenant Colonel Albert Ernest Sompreux, who had been selected to lead the panel of 7 military judges that would determine Mata Hari's fate. Sompreux was a professional soldier of considerable experience, a man shaped by the doctrines and values of the French military establishment at a moment when that establishment was under more strain than it had faced since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. He had the bearing of a man who took his institutional responsibilities seriously, who believed in the military system and its procedures, and who was not inclined toward sentimentality in the application of military justice. The prosecution was led by Lieutenant André Mornet, a military lawyer who would go on to a distinguished legal career in France after the war. He later served as public prosecutor in the post-war trials of French collaborators, including the trial of Marshal Pétain in 1945. In 1917, he was a young and capable advocate with a well-prepared case, an accessible narrative, and the institutional support of French military intelligence behind him. He had the intercepted German radio messages, which were introduced in evidence. He had the proof of the 20,000 franc payment from Kromer. He had the established fact that Mata Hari had met with Karl Kromer's network and had been assigned the German intelligence designation H-21. He had testimony from the surveillance team that had monitored her movements in Paris before her arrest. He had Ledoux's carefully hedged testimony, which confirmed her approach to French intelligence while casting doubt on whether she had ever been formally authorized as a French agent. What Mornet did not have, and what the historical examination of the case has consistently identified as the crucial gap in the prosecution's evidence, was proof of specific harm to France. The charges required that she had provided the enemy with information that had materially assisted German military operations. The intercepted radio messages established that German intelligence believed she had been productive. But what Mata Hari had actually told Kali, and whether anything she said had been communicated forward into German military planning in a way that produced concrete results, was never demonstrated to a forensic legal standard. The prosecution presented circumstantial evidence of the intelligence relationship and asked the tribunal to infer that this relationship had damaged France. It did not present documented instances of French military information appearing in German operational decisions as a result of Mata Hari's disclosures. This gap was the engine of Clunet's defense strategy, to the extent that he had one. He argued that the prosecution had proven that his client had been recruited by Germany and had accepted German money, but had not proven that she had ever delivered anything of value in return. He attempted to paint the 20,000 francs as exactly what she had described, restitution for frozen funds, rather than advance payment for intelligence services. He sought to establish her work for France as genuine, calling witnesses who could attest to her relationship with Ledoux and her activities in Paris and Spain. The problem with this strategy was threefold. First, Ledoux's testimony did not support it cleanly. Second, the classified character of the radio message evidence meant that the defense could not effectively challenge the technical foundation of the prosecution's most damaging exhibit. Third, and perhaps most important in practical terms, Clunet was not an effective advocate before a military tribunal. He was elderly, unfamiliar with military law, and emotionally close to his client in a way that sometimes impaired rather than enhanced his advocacy. He made arguments that a military judge might find compelling in a civil context but that fell flat against the institutional priorities of a military court in wartime. The tribunal proceedings were in camera, closed to the public and to the general press. A small number of authorized observers attended, but the material that entered the public record was limited by wartime secrecy provisions. Mata Hari was permitted to testify, and she did so at length. The accounts of her testimony from participants suggest that she was organized, articulate, and consistent. She told essentially the same story she had told Bouchardon during the long months of interrogation, maintaining her position as a French agent who had never intentionally harmed France. She addressed the individual charges systematically. She did not become emotional in a way that could be read as weakness or breakdown. What she could not do, and what no amount of personal composure could accomplish, was address the fundamental problem with her situation. She had been enrolled as a German intelligence agent under the designation H-21. German radio communications had referred to her in that capacity. She had met with German intelligence personnel. She had taken German money. Even if the purpose for which she took the money was what she claimed, these facts existed. They were documented. They were legally sufficient under the framework of wartime military justice to support the charges against her. The trial ran for 2 days, July 24th and July 25th, 1917. The deliberations took approximately 45 minutes. The tribunal found her guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by firing squad. Mornet delivered the sentence. Samprou pronounced it. Clunet, by the accounts of those present, appeared shaken. Not one suspects because the verdict was unexpected, but because the finality of it, its specific form, landed with the weight that all death sentences carry regardless of how long they have been anticipated. Mata Hari received the verdict with a composure that was noted by multiple observers. She did not cry. She did not protest in any theatrical way. She thanked her counsel and was let out. She was returned to Saint-Lazare. The formal legal process was not yet completely exhausted. Under French military law, a condemned person had certain rights of petition, including the right to seek a reconsideration of the verdict or clemency from the President of the Republic. This process had rarely resulted in the reversal of a military tribunal verdict during the war, but it existed, and both Clunet and the Dutch diplomatic mission seized on it as the remaining avenue for intervention. Clunet filed for appeal, arguing the legal insufficiency of the evidence and the procedural inadequacies of the defense. The legal arguments he raised, including the technical point that the evidence of actual harm to France was absent and that this was a required element of the offense, were genuine legal arguments of the kind that a higher court might engage with in ordinary circumstances. In the France of 1917, with military authority dominant in the legal apparatus and the atmosphere of wartime crisis pressing on every institutional judgment, the appetite for extended legal review of military tribunal decisions in espionage cases was essentially non-existent. The appeal was denied. There remained the petition for executive clemency, addressed to President Raymond Poincaré. The petition was filed by Clunet and supported by the Dutch diplomatic community, which had been pressing for consideration of her Dutch nationality and the possibility that the intelligence relationship with Germany had been less substantial than the prosecution claimed. Poincaré had the power to commute the sentence. He chose not to exercise it. The clemency petition was denied in September 1917. Outside Saint-Lazare, Paris continued. The cafes served what they had to serve. The newspapers reported what they were permitted to report. The war ground forward on the Western Front, with the British and Canadian operations at Passchendaele extracting another enormous toll from the summer and autumn fighting. The French army, stabilized under Pétain's careful management, manned its lines without the mutinous agitation of the spring, though the underlying fragility remained. The city was tired in the way that a person is tired after years of sustained fear, not the tiredness of a single hard day but the deeper tiredness that settles into the bones and the way people speak and the way they hold their faces in public. Inside Saint-Lazare, the weeks between the verdict and the execution accumulated. Mata Hari knew the date. It had been set for October 15, 1917, and the calendar advanced toward it with the indifference of calendars. She had not heard from Maslov. She would write one more letter. The question that historians have returned to repeatedly in the centuries since her execution is a simple one in its formulation and maddeningly complex in its answer. Was Mata Hari actually a spy in any meaningful sense, or was she a woman whom circumstances, bad decisions, and institutional necessity had constructed into one? The answer, examined carefully and honestly, is both and neither, and something in between that the available legal categories of the time were not designed to accommodate. Start with what is not in dispute. She accepted 20,000 francs from Karl Kromer, representing German intelligence in Amsterdam. She was assigned the code designation H21 within the German Abteilung 3B filing system. She met with Major Arnold Colley, a documented German intelligence officer, in Madrid, and during those meetings she appears to have shared information impressions about French military morale, names of French officers, observations about the mood in Paris and the state of the Allied war effort. German radio messages subsequently referred to H21 as a productive source. She had not cleared any of this with French intelligence in advance, and she had not disclosed her German connection to Ledoux when she offered to work for France. None of this is contested by serious historians. The question is what it adds up to. Consider the intelligence that she actually passed to Germany. The historical researchers who have examined the French intelligence files most closely, including the Dutch historian Julie Wheelwright, the American scholar Sam Wagenaar, and the most methodologically rigorous study of the case, conducted by French intelligence historian Lyon Sherman, have reached a consistent conclusion. The information Mata Hari provided to German intelligence was either already in German possession through other channels, was too vague and general to have operational military value, or was the kind of social atmospheric intelligence, morale assessments, personal impressions, that might be useful for general situational awareness but could not be translated into specific military advantage. More pointed still is what several researchers have argued about the intercepted Kali radio messages themselves. The German cipher that Kali used for his Madrid to Berlin transmissions was one that French and British signals intelligence had broken. This was almost certainly known to German intelligence. Professional counterintelligence officers monitored their own communications for signs of compromise, and the regular pattern of Allied counterintelligence actions in areas where German radio traffic was heavy should have signaled that the ciphers were not secure. Kali was an experienced intelligence officer. He knew or very probably suspected that his radio messages could be read in Paris. This creates a deeply uncomfortable possibility. Kali sent the messages identifying H21 as a productive agent precisely because he knew France would read them. His purpose may not have been to communicate operational intelligence to Berlin. His purpose may have been to communicate to the French decryption service that Mata Hari was a German agent, thereby triggering exactly the investigation and prosecution that followed. Why would he do this? Several reasons are plausible. She might have been becoming a liability, an undisciplined amateur operating in Madrid and Paris, someone whose loose behavior and lack of tradecraft was creating exposure for German intelligence operations. Burning her to the French would eliminate the liability neatly. Alternatively, Kali may have concluded that she was genuinely working primarily for France and had decided to give Ledoux something he could use, a double cross that served German intelligence by eliminating someone who might be passing real German operational information to France. A third possibility is that the German intelligence community simply had no further use for her and chose a tidy method of disposal. In any of these scenarios, the radio messages are not evidence of Mata Hari's espionage for Germany. They are evidence of German intelligence's decision to triangulate her with French counterintelligence. This distinction between a document proving what it appears to prove and a document deliberately crafted to be intercepted and misread is the kind of distinction that requires sophisticated technical analysis of the intelligence apparatus to evaluate. The military tribunal of July 1917 conducted no such analysis. There is also the question of the invisible ink. Cromer gave her, she testified, 2 small bottles of a liquid he described as invisible writing fluid. She said she threw them away. The French prosecution treated this as evidence of the infrastructure of German espionage, the tradecraft tools that confirmed her professional status as a German agent. But the French chemists who examined the bottles, or the bottles she later produced during her interrogation, if the account is accurate, found nothing conclusive. The invisible ink story is one of the elements of the case that appears in some accounts and is ambiguous or absent in others, and the forensic evidence is not sufficiently documented to put weight on it either way. What is clear, and this is perhaps the element of the case that most clearly indicts the French judicial process rather than the accused, is that the trial produced no specific victim. No French officer whose information was compromised by Mata Hari was ever identified. No French intelligence asset who was burned because she reported them to Germany was ever named. No operational decision by the German military was ever shown to have been taken on the basis of intelligence traceable to her. The prosecution presented a structure, the payment, the code designation, the meetings, the radio messages, and asked the tribunal to conclude that a woman embedded in the structure must have caused harm, even if the specific harm could not be demonstrated. At least one senior French official expressed private doubts about the case after the verdict. The head of French military intelligence during this period, Colonel Gaubit, later suggested in conversations documented by contemporaries that the case against Mata Hari, while legally sustainable, was not in his view the case of a significant spy. He believed she had operated at the margins of both German and French intelligence, providing neither side with genuinely significant material, and had been prosecuted partly because the institutional requirement for a high-profile espionage conviction in that terrible year of 1917 needed a candidate. The British intelligence assessment, as reflected in Basil Thomson's later communications and published memoirs, was similar in tone. Thomson, who had interviewed her in London and remained engaged with the case, expressed the view after the war that she was probably a spy in a technical sense. She had entered into an intelligence relationship with Germany and had received payment, but that the intelligence value of her work was slight and that she was unlikely to have been the major agent the French prosecution painted her as. He suggested that her execution, while legally defensible under the wartime framework, was a significant event in the history of espionage mythology somewhat out of proportion to her actual intelligence significance. The question of what she had actually disclosed to Germany during her meetings with Colley in Madrid has one more dimension that deserves examination. Some of what she admitted to telling Colley was later characterized by the prosecution as sensitive military information. One example frequently cited concerns German agents who had landed on the French coast by submarine. She had apparently learned of these agents from French sources and had disclosed this to Colley, suggesting that France knew about the operation. If accurate, this would constitute a piece of counterintelligence that France could have used and that she had instead given to Germany, potentially jeopardizing a French surveillance operation against those agents. This specific charge, if true, represents the most substantive piece of actual intelligence harm that can be documented in the case. But the sourcing and verification level for this claim is limited. It rests primarily on the prosecution's reconstruction of what she told Colley, based on information she provided during interrogations. The chain of custody for this intelligence piece, and whether French intelligence operations were actually damaged by its disclosure, is not fully established in the historical record. So where does this leave us? Mata Hari was not innocent in the sense of having had no involvement with German intelligence. She was enrolled as H-21. She took money. She met Colley. She told him things she probably should not have disclosed, by any standard of careful judgment. She was running two intelligence relationships simultaneously without fully disclosing either to the other side, which is a recipe for exactly the kind of disaster she experienced. But she was almost certainly not the master spy of wartime legend, the femme fatale whose seductions extracted vital secrets and caused the deaths of French soldiers. That figure was partly constructed by the prosecution's framing, partly amplified by the press coverage that turned her case into a morality tale about female sexuality and national security, and partly maintained by a cultural imagination that found the exotic dancer turned deadly spy more compelling than the actual woman. Tired, 40 years old, genuinely in love with a young Russian who wasn't writing back, trying to navigate an impossible situation with tools that were never adequate for the task. The truth of her case is more complicated than legend, and more poignant, and in some ways harder to sit with, because complexity and pathos don't resolve into the clean narratives that make death feel explicable. France executed her anyway. In the weeks between the verdict and the execution, St. Lazare prison held Mata Hari in the particular suspended time of someone waiting for a death they know is coming. It is a unique psychological condition, not the unspecific dread of a person who knows they might die someday, but the precise and bounded fear of a person who has a date. The date was October 15, 1917. It was on the calendar like a fixed star. On December 8, 1972, 3 weeks before Christmas, the team placed a call to Hamshari's apartment from a phone box. When he answered and identified himself, a signal was sent that detonated the device beneath his telephone. Hamshari sustained catastrophic injuries and survived for approximately 1 month before dying in hospital on January 9, 1973. The investigation into the bombing by French police yielded no arrests and no official attribution, though French intelligence services formed a private view about its origin. The case formally remained open. 2 targets down in 2 capital cities in less than 6 weeks. The operation had found its rhythm. And the list, the document that the committee was updating regularly and Harari was receiving in stages, still had many names remaining. The winter of 1972 moving into the spring of 1973 was the most operationally intense period of the entire campaign's first phase, a stretch of months during which the team moved through European cities with the professional momentum of people who had found their operating rhythm and had not yet encountered anything capable of breaking it. Cyprus, France, Belgium, Spain, The geography of Mossad's pursuit in this period mapped the geography of Black September's European presence, which was itself a reflection of the broader Palestinian political diaspora distributed across the continent in the years following the expulsions from Jordan. Hussein al-Bashir was the third man on the working list, and his killing took place not in Western Europe but in Nicosia, Cyprus on January 24, 1973. Al-Bashir was a senior member of the Black September Network whose specific role has been described variously in different sources: intelligence coordinator, financial conduit, organizational intermediary, but whose presence on the list placed him in the category of figures whose elimination the committee considered operationally significant. He was staying in room 202 of the Hotel Nicosia Ambassador when the device planted under his mattress detonated in the early hours of the morning. The explosion destroyed the room and killed al-Bashir instantly. Cypriot police investigated. No arrests were made. 3 weeks later, on January 26th, a Mossad officer named Baruch Cohen was shot and killed in Madrid by a Black September operative. Cohen had been working undercover in Spain as part of the intelligence-gathering network feeding target information to the operation. His killing was a significant loss for the program and a demonstration that Black September was not passively absorbing the campaign against it. The organization had its own intelligence capability in Europe, and it was being used to identify and eliminate the Israeli presence. The operation had never been a simple one-directional hunt. It had always been a mutual and dangerous contest being conducted in civilian urban spaces among millions of uninvolved people. April of 1973 brought the killing of Basil Al-Kabaisi in Paris. Al-Kabaisi was a professor of law at the American University of Beirut who also served as a Black September operative with primary responsibilities in logistics and weapons procurement, another of the dual lives that characterized several figures on the list, the academic or intellectual exterior housing an operational role in the organization. He was shot on a Paris street in the evening. 2 men fired multiple rounds and departed on foot into the darkness of the city. French authorities investigated and reached no public conclusion. Then came Mohamed Boudia, and with Boudia something shifted in the operational texture of the campaign, not in the method, which was a car bomb rather than a shooting, but in the specific quality of what Boudia represented as a target. Boudia was an Algerian-born theater director and political organizer who would become the principal coordinator of Black September's operations in France following Mahmoud Hamshari's death. He was a genuinely remarkable figure, dramatically gifted, politically sophisticated, personally compelling, and operationally expert. He had managed escape routes, laundered money, recruited operatives from the European radical left, and organized the logistical infrastructure for multiple Black September operations conducted in and through France. He was also, according to French security services who had been watching him for some time, very difficult to catch out in any detectable mistake. He changed apartments frequently, varied his routes, used multiple identities, and had an instinct for threat assessment that had kept him operational for years. He was killed on June 28, 1973, by a bomb placed under the seat of his car in the 6th arrondissement of Paris. He had begun his car, driven a short distance, and triggered the device, which killed him instantly and left the vehicle a burned wreck on a Parisian side street. His death represented a significant operational loss for Black September in France and required the organization to spend considerable time and resources rebuilding the French network from a much reduced position. It also, almost immediately, set in motion the appointment of a replacement who would prove both formidable and central to the operation's most consequential failure several weeks later. But before we continue into that darker chapter, if you're finding this story as gripping as we do at the Dead Drop, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss one of our deep dives into the world's most extraordinary espionage stories. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Your support genuinely keeps this channel going and helps us keep bringing you the stories that deserve to be told. By the summer of 1973, the campaign had killed at least 5 significant targets across 4 countries in 8 months. Mossad's operational pace had been remarkable both for its consistency and for what it had not yet generated. A catastrophic mistake, a diplomatic crisis, an exposure that could unravel the whole enterprise. Within the organization, This operational stretch was understood to demonstrate Caesarea's professional capability at its most effective. Outside the organization, within the European intelligence services that were privately forming their own conclusions about the pattern of killings, the assessment was similar. Whoever was doing this was very good. Leeuwarden's claim on her memory is one of the more poignant ironies of her story. She spent her adult life constructing an identity that was the opposite of everything Leeuwarden represented. The flat provincial Dutch city was the thing she had escaped, the damp, orderly, Calvinist reality against which the invented Javanese goddess was the deliberate counterimage. And yet Leeuwarden has claimed her most persistently. In 1976, on the centenary of her birth, the city erected a bronze statue in the center of the city. A figure in a pose that references her dance performances, placed at the intersection of streets that she had walked as a girl before her father's prosperity collapsed. The statue is, in its way, a complicated object. It commemorates a woman who denied the city. It celebrates someone whose most celebrated quality, the invention of a self completely removed from ordinary Dutch reality, was precisely a rejection of everything the statue's setting represents. The pride Leeuwarden takes in its most famous daughter is partly the civic impulse to claim any significant figure, and partly something more genuine. The recognition that a woman who grew up there in modest circumstances managed to make herself utterly remarkable, which is something any city might reasonably take some note of, even if the remarkableness was complicated. The German government declassified certain intelligence files relating to the First World War espionage apparatus at various points in the 20th century. These files, accessed by researchers, have produced remarkably little in the Mata Hari direction that supports the prosecution's portrait of a major spy. The H-21 designation exists. The recruitment by Kromer is documented. The Madrid communications are there. What is not there? And this is the persistent evidentiary absence that the revisionist historians have built their arguments on, is documentation of significant intelligence passed by H-21 that entered German military planning in any traceable way. The German intelligence archive reflects, where it bears on her at all, something close to a minor and not especially productive source relationship rather than the strategically significant asset the French prosecution described. The French intelligence archive has been much more restrictive about access and declassification, which has itself become a source of speculation among researchers. Some historians have argued that the reluctance to fully open the French files reflects continuing institutional embarrassment about the quality of the case, that a full examination would reveal not evidence of her significance as a spy but evidence of the institutional pressures and procedural shortcuts that produced the conviction and execution of a woman whose actual intelligence significance was limited. This argument cannot be definitively confirmed without full access to the relevant files. What can be said is that the archival picture, as it currently stands, does not support the legendary spy of the wartime press. What does the case represent viewed a century later? It represents, most clearly, the machinery of a state under existential pressure, compressing its legal standards under the weight of crisis. It represents the dynamics of scapegoating in wartime, the institutional and social need to put faces on the enemy, to point at individuals as the authors of national suffering, even when the suffering is the product of structural forces and political decisions no individual could create or prevent. Mata Hari was the right kind of scapegoat for 1917 France. Foreign, sexually unconventional by the standards of the era, connected to German social networks in a way that was real even if its espionage significance was limited, and publicly famous enough to make the prosecution's message land with the force that anonymous cases cannot achieve. It also represents the particular vulnerability of the genuinely ambiguous, people who exist in the spaces between clear categories, who have taken money from people they shouldn't have and told things to people they shouldn't have told them, but who have not done anything that rises to the level of harm that is being attributed to them. These people are not innocent in any pure sense, but their culpability does not match their punishment, and the gap between those two things is where injustice lives, specifically in times and places when institutions decide the gap is an acceptable cost. She told the truth at the end, which is a strange thing to say about a woman who had built her entire public existence on fiction. But the truth she told in Saint Lazare, the truth about what she had done and what she had intended and what she had never done, was consistent and documentable and more accurate than the story that convicted her. It wasn't believed. and she was 41 years old, in the autumn light at Vincennes. In a gray dress she had chosen herself for the occasion. She faced the firing squad on October 15, 1917. She did not wear a blindfold. The polygon at the Château de Vincennes is a wide, flat expanse of ground enclosed by the stone walls of the old fortification on the eastern edge of Paris. In the early morning of October 15, 1917, the autumn light was thin and without warmth, coming in low over the trees that line the edge of the Bois de Vincennes to the south. The recent rains had left the ground damp. The sky was the gray of late October in northern France. Not the bright, sharp gray of a cold, clear day, but the soft, dense gray of a sky that might produce rain at any moment and has decided not to hurry the decision. The firing squad was composed of Zelle soldiers, members of a French colonial light infantry unit that had its origins in North Africa and whose distinctive uniform, preserved even in 1917 wartime, included elements of Algerian and Moroccan dress. They were professional soldiers. They had been given their orders and they understood what was required of them. They stood in line with the practiced stillness of men who have been trained to hold a position. The witnesses assembled at a designated distance. They included Bouchardon, who had conducted the interrogations. They included representatives of the Dutch consulate, who had maintained their formal engagement with the case to its conclusion. They included military observers whose presence was required by procedure. The priest who was present had made the appropriate spiritual preparations. The convoy from Saint-Lazare arrived. The doors opened. She stepped out. At 5 in the morning on October 15th, Bouchardon arrived at Saint-Lazare. He entered her cell to formally inform her that no further appeals or interventions had been received, and that the execution would proceed as scheduled at dawn. He was accompanied by her defense attorney Clunet, and by the prison's religious attendants. She received the notification in the way she had been receiving everything for months, with a control that onlookers found remarkable and that some found unnatural, as if the control itself was a form of statement. She dressed. She wrote 2 more short notes. She was offered brandy, which she accepted. Sister Leonide embraced her. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, Mata Hari was brought out of Saint-Lazare and placed in the vehicle that would carry her to the Château de Vincennes and the polygon of the firing range on its grounds. The convoy moved through the early Paris streets in the particular quiet of a city not yet fully awake, past the dark storefronts and the bare-limbed trees and the Seine running gray and quick under the October sky. She had lived 41 years. She had been born in a flat Dutch city and had made herself into something extraordinary, however you evaluate the specific terms of what she had become. She had crossed oceans and continents and cultures and wars. She had been a wife and a mother and a dancer and a courtesan and a spy, or something close enough to each of those things that the word fits with only minor inaccuracy. She had generated more legend than fact and more story than most people get, and none of it had been sufficient protection against the particular convergence of her choices and her era and a France desperate enough to convert someone's complicated life into a clean cautionary tale. The polygon at Vincennes was cold in the early morning light. The men of the firing squad were already positioned. The witnesses were in their places. The last chapter was a short one. The figure of the femme fatale is one of the most durable archetypes in Western cultural imagination, and it is almost entirely about male anxiety. She appears throughout literature and mythology. The woman whose beauty is a weapon, whose desire is designed to destroy, who uses sex as a strategic instrument to obtain power over men who cannot resist her. She is Delilah with the scissors. She is the siren on the rocks. She is, specifically in the early 20th century, the spy as seductress, the woman who moves through military clubs and diplomatic receptions extracting secrets from officers who should know better. Mata Hari was immediately recruited into this archetype the moment her arrest became public, and she has never entirely escaped it. The news of her trial and execution was reported in papers across France, Britain, and the neutral world in August and October 1917, and the framing was consistent. The most dangerous spy in Europe, the woman who had betrayed France's secrets to Germany, the exotic dancer who had used her legendary charms to extract military intelligence from hundreds of high-ranking officers. The word hundreds appeared in several accounts, as did specific claims about the identities of her supposed victims. French generals, ministers, even royalty. Almost none of these specific claims had any documentary foundation. The French prosecution had not named specific officers whose secrets she had extracted. No French military operation had been identified as compromised by her intelligence work. The dramatic expansion of her activities in the press was a phenomenon entirely separate from the legal case against her. It was mythology being manufactured in real time, fed by the appetite of a wartime public for a villain whose nature could explain some part of the inexplicable tragedy of what had been happening on the Western Front. In this mythology, the deaths at Verdun and the Somme and Passchendaele could be connected, however tenuously, to the work of a beautiful woman who had seduced the men who should have been protecting France's secrets. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, a fantasy, not the fantasy of sexual desire but the fantasy of legibility, the human need to have causes that match effects, to find faces that can be held responsible for suffering on a scale that has no individual human face. She was dead before the mythology was fully assembled. By the time the press accounts reached their most elaborate versions, dozens of high-ranking victims, millions of francs in German payments, secrets sufficient to swing the course of the war, she had been in the ground for weeks and could not dispute any of it. The ground itself is part of what made the aftermath strange. No family member claimed her body. Rudolf MacLeod, who had remarried and was living out the war in the Netherlands, did not come. Nan, her daughter, did not come or was not able to come. The consulate did not arrange collection. Her remains were turned over to a medical faculty in Paris for anatomical study, which was the standard disposition for executed prisoners whose bodies were not claimed. What specifically happened to her physical remains after that is a question the historical record has not fully resolved. There are accounts suggesting her head was preserved by the Museum of Anatomy in Paris as a specimen from a notorious case, but attempts to verify this in the museum's institutional records have produced ambiguous results. Her possessions, the clothes in her hotel room, the jewelry she had accumulated over 2 decades, were disposed of without any comprehensive inventory reaching the public record. The letters she had written in Saint-Lazare were held for some time in prison files before various pieces entered the archival system or private collections. The pearl gray dress she had chosen for her execution existed somewhere, presumably, in the aftermath of the mourning, no longer required for its original purpose. The belongings of her earlier life, the performing costumes, the correspondence of the Paris years, the documentation of the famous career, were scattered through the estates of patrons, the collections of newspapers and magazines that had published her photographs, and the various venues where she had performed. The Musée Guémet, where the story had begun in 1905, eventually developed a collection of materials related to that debut performance. The Frisian Museum in Leeuwarden, the city of her birth, later assembled a collection of Mata Hari materials that stands now as the most comprehensive institutional holding of artifacts and documentation related to her life. Multiple accounts of the execution were left by people who were present, and they converge on several specific details. She was dressed in the pearl gray dress she had chosen, with the wide-brimmed hat and a long dark coat over everything. She moved with her characteristic bearing, not performing confidence in the theatrical way of her stage years, but carrying herself with the upright posture that had been hers since long before she was famous. One witness described her as looking more composed than anyone else present. She was offered the option of a blindfold. She declined. The officer commanding the firing squad read the formal judicial finding and the sentence. The words were spoken in the early morning air with a formality that the setting, the stone walls, the damp ground, the line of soldiers, amplified into something beyond ceremony. Her hands were not bound. She was offered the option of binding and again declined. She was stood against the post that had been set for the purpose. She looked at the soldiers facing her. Accounts differ on whether she said anything. One witness reported that she blew a kiss toward the assembled witnesses, which other accounts do not confirm. Whatever the specific details of those last few seconds, The image that has survived in the cultural memory is the one the witnesses agreed on. She stood upright, facing the rifles with her eyes open. The command was given. 12 soldiers fired. The sound crossed the polygon and died against the stone walls. She fell. The officer in charge of the execution walked forward, as required by French military procedure, and administered the coup de grace with his sidearm, firing at close range to confirm death. The act was formal and quick, a procedural requirement rather than anything beyond it. She was dead at approximately 6:47 in the morning on October 15, 1917. The war continued for 13 more months. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. The total dead across all combatant nations, by the most conservative scholarly estimates, exceeded 17 million people. The strategic significance of what Mata Hari had passed to German intelligence, in the final accounting of the war, was too small to be visible in the historical record of those 17 million deaths. No historian has identified a battle, an offensive, a tactical operation in which H-21's intelligence was a determinative factor. No French soldier's death has been traced to information she provided. The executed spies of the First World War were collectively many. The French executed dozens of people for espionage during the conflict, the British somewhat fewer, the Germans more. The institutional machinery of wartime counterintelligence produced convictions at a rate that historians have subsequently analyzed with varying degrees of skepticism about the underlying quality of the evidence. Some of the people executed were genuine and active agents of the opposing sides. Some were not. Mata Hari occupies a specific position in this spectrum, neither purely constructed nor genuinely significant. And this ambiguity is precisely what has kept her case alive in the historical literature when most of her contemporaries have been forgotten. The mythology that grew around her name in the decades following her execution was extraordinary in its reach and its durability. The word Mata Hari entered multiple languages as a synonym for the seductive female spy, the woman who uses sexual access as an intelligence instrument. Films were made about her. Greta Garbo played her in a 1931 Hollywood production that bore little relationship to historical fact but that fixed the glamorous, enigmatic image in the global cultural memory with the intensity that only cinema can achieve. Novels, plays, operas, and subsequent film and television productions continued through the 20th century and into the 21st. The name has appeared in advertising, in military slang, in the names of bars and restaurants and aircraft, in countless contexts where the specific person has been entirely replaced by the archetype she became. This cultural saturation has shaped the way even careful researchers approach her case, because the archetype is always present, whispering its explanatory seductions, making her activities seem more consequential and her sexuality more central to the intelligence operation than the evidence actually supports. She was not primarily an intelligence operative who used sex. She was primarily a woman who lived by social connection and personal charm, in whose social world powerful men were ubiquitous, and whose intelligence activities, real but limited, were incidental to that social life rather than its organizing purpose. The distinction matters for how we understand not just her individual case but the broader phenomenon she represents. The female spy as seductress is a figure that intelligence services themselves have historically both employed and been suspicious of. Employed because sexual access can in certain circumstances produce genuine intelligence access. Suspicious because the archetype, when it operates as a framework for prosecution rather than actual evidence, can be used to convict women who are guilty primarily of unconventional sexual lives in contexts where conventional morality and national security anxiety reinforce each other. Several women were executed for espionage during the First World War by various belligerent powers. Mata Hari is the most famous by a considerable margin, and the fame is disproportionate to the scale of her activities compared to some of the others. Edith Cavell, the British nurse executed by Germany in 1915 for helping Allied prisoners escape from occupied Belgium, was engaged in activities of considerably more direct military significance than anything Mata Hari did, and her case generated comparable international outrage. But Cavell is remembered primarily as a martyr for humanitarian service rather than as a spy in the cultural imagination's sense. The difference in how the two women are remembered tracks precisely to the sexual dimension of the Mata Hari narrative. The seductress spy generated, and continues to generate, a different quality of cultural attention than the nurse compassionate because she activates different anxieties. In the Netherlands, the rehabilitation of Mata Hari as a historical figure has been a gradual and still incomplete process. The Frisian Museum in Leeuwarden has worked to present the historical record over the myth, the actual woman from Friesland, her actual circumstances, the documented evidence about her intelligence activities and their actual scope. The bronze statue in the city center presents her in a form that is more about local pride than accurate historical representation, but the scholarship associated with the museum's collection is serious. In France, the official record has never been formally reopened. The trial transcripts and the intelligence files remain subject to varying degrees of access restriction. No formal government acknowledgement has been made that the prosecution's evidence overstated her role or that the conviction served institutional rather than purely legal purposes. The case is part of the history of the First World War's intelligence and justice systems, and France has not found it expedient to revisit it in the way that, for example, the rehabilitation of Alfred Dreyfus, the French army officer falsely convicted of espionage in 1894 in a case driven by antisemitism, was eventually managed through formal governmental action. The Dreyfus comparison is one that historians of the Mata Hari case raise with some frequency. There are real differences. Dreyfus was entirely innocent, while Mata Hari had genuine connections to German intelligence, but there are also real structural similarities in the dynamics of prosecution. The need for an enemy within, the bending of evidence to institutional necessity, the role that the defendant's social identity, Jewish in one case, female and sexually unconventional in the other, played in their vulnerability to conviction. Both cases illuminate the ways in which the French military justice system in the early 20th century could produce verdicts that served political and institutional purposes at the expense of individual ones. The woman herself, Margaretha Geertruida Zelle, born in Leeuwarden in 1876 and executed at Vincennes in 1917, was not the legend. She was a remarkable person in ways the legend obscures as much as it celebrates. She built an identity from almost nothing and sustained it across 2 decades in the most sophisticated social environments in Europe. She educated herself in multiple languages and cultural traditions. She survived a brutal marriage, the loss of a child, the loss of another child to legal dispossession, the collapse of a career, and a world war with a resourcefulness and resilience that the legend's obsessive focus on sexuality routinely obscures. She made serious mistakes. She took money from Germany in circumstances that were legally indefensible. She managed 2 intelligence relationships without proper transparency. She failed to understand the specific vulnerability that the compromised German cipher created for her, which is partly a failure of knowledge and partly a failure of the tradecraft she was never given. The mistakes were serious ones, and they were hers. But the execution, viewed honestly across the distance of a century, was not commensurate with what she had actually done. It was a specific product of a specific moment. France in 1917, hemorrhaging lives on the Western Front, looking for a face to put on the enemy within, finding one that fit the cultural template well enough to serve the purpose. The execution served that purpose. What it did not do was serve justice in the sense that justice requires proportionality between proven harm and imposed punishment. She faced the rifles without a blindfold. That detail, the open eyes, the refusal of the cloth, has been interpreted in every way imaginable. As bravery, as performance, as defiance, as simple preference, as the professional instinct of someone who had spent 40 years commanding rooms and could not stop at the very end. All of those interpretations are probably partially right. What they collectively point to is a woman who did not flinch, who had looked at difficult things directly for so long that looking away was not available to her. She had come from Leeuwarden and made herself into a legend and back into a woman and back into a legend again. And at the end of it all, she stood on damp ground in a gray dress in the October light and looked at the men who were going to kill her. History has been looking back at her ever since.